One night in 1946, a Brazilian farmer was walking along this dirt path when suddenly he started feeling like he was being watched. And so he looked to his right and to his left into the trees of the rainforest on either side of him, but he couldn't see any animals or people. There was no movement. It was eerily quiet and dark. And so the farmer told himself that he was okay, just keep going, get home. And so as he's walking, he begins speeding up faster and faster because the anxiety is growing inside of him, because he can't shake this feeling that he's being watched. And so finally, when he's close enough to his village, he just starts running, fearing that whatever or whoever is watching him is going to jump out and grab him. And so he speeds to his house. He literally dives through an open window into his house. He shuts the window. He makes sure all the doors are locked. And he's standing there in his house. It's pitch black. And he's thinking, okay, I'm safe. But suddenly he realizes not only has this feeling not gone away, he still feels like he's being watched, but whoever or whatever is watching him, he knows without looking that they're right outside of his house, outside the window to his left. And when he turned to look, he was right. What happened next would prompt a full-scale military investigation into a subject that can only be classified as paranormal. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please figure out which book the like button is reading currently, and when they're about halfway done with it, spoil the ending. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On March 4th, 1946, nearly every resident of a rural Brazilian town called Araçariguama packed up a few days' worth of food and drink and headed south to the nearest big city to celebrate the Festival of Carnaval. This festival is an opportunity for folks to cut loose and eat good food right before most of them go into a religious fasting period. One resident who opted not to join the fun at this festival was a 44-year-old man named João Prestige Filho. João was a farmer. He had 5 kids. He was a very quiet guy, and he did not enjoy things like the festival for Carnival. The crowds and the noise made him anxious, and he really hated dancing, which there was a lot of at these festivals. Instead, João would rather spend his spare time out in nature. And so, when João's friends and family and everybody else disappeared to head off to this festival, João did just that. He and his best friend packed up João's horse and cart, and they traveled across the dirt roads through the woods to the nearby Tietê River, where they spent the day fishing for catfish. And as João stood on the rocks casting out his line, he listened to the birds sing and the parrots swooping by. It was beautiful and sunny out. I mean, this was a perfect day for João. As sunset drew near, though, both João and his best friend knew that while the rainforest they were in was beautiful during the day, at night it could become quite hazardous with the animals that come out at night, and so they knew they needed to leave. And so they packed up all the fish they caught back into João's cart, and then the two of them hopped onto the cart and began making the journey back towards the town of Araçariguama. When the pair got to a split in the road, João's best friend hopped off the cart and walked on foot down one path because his house was actually just outside of the town, and João, still in his cart with his horse, said bye to his friend and went the other direction. Now, by this point, the sun had completely set, and so it was totally dark out as João is going down this dirt road in the final stretch towards his town. At this time, in 1946, Araçariguama was a beautiful place, but by no means a modern place. They had no running water, no electricity, there was no sewage, no paved roads, no access to main roads, and nobody had a telephone. It was basically like this little patch of civilization with about 100 people living there. There was a church in the middle of the town and a couple of small huts that kind of sat around it. And João and his family lived in one of those huts. João usually loved walking along or traveling along this particular stretch of dirt road, especially at night, like he was doing right now. He really enjoyed looking up at the stars and listening to the animals off in the forest that he couldn't see. But this night, Joao just had a bad feeling as he was making this final approach towards his town. Now remember, there's almost no one in the town. They're all at this festival, so it's kind of like a ghost town in the middle of a forest. But Joao, as he's going down this dirt road and he can see the church up ahead, he's a couple hundred feet away, he began getting this very unnerving sense that he was being watched. And so Joao, as he's in his cart, began looking into the trees and all around him, wondering if maybe an animal or a person was nearby, but there was no one. Finally, Joao actually reached the church and he could see his little house, and he could also see that his wife, who was at the festival, had opened up one of the windows just slightly so he could open it up the rest of the way and crawl into the house when he was back from fishing, because she had locked the doors when she left. And so by this point, Joao was trying to be very calm and collected despite the stress of feeling like he's being watched. But when he saw that window and he saw how close he was to his house, he basically just had the horse sprint the rest of the way to his home. He just wanted to get off the streets. And so finally, Joao, he reaches his house, he crawls in through the window, he shuts it behind him, and immediately Joao expected to feel totally relieved that he was now behind locked and closed doors and windows. He was safe. But despite being inside of his home, he still had this sense that there was someone or something around him that was watching him. Joao, like many other residents of this village, was fairly superstitious. There was an old abandoned mine that was near the town, and Joao and his peers had grown up hearing stories about some monster that lived in the mine that would come out at night and roam the forest. And older people in this village would talk about this ancient serpent called Boitata that would come out at night and it would appear in a burst of fire. And so Joao, he's thinking about the mine and these demons and ghosts that roam in the forest, and he's all alone because everyone's at this festival and he doesn't feel safe inside of his house, and so he's really starting to panic. And it's at this moment that he suddenly feels this sense that whatever or whoever has been watching him is right out his window to his left. And so Joao, as he's turning to look out the window, he's anticipating seeing a person out there, or maybe a jaguar or some other animal that's followed him from the rainforest. But when Joao turns and looks out the window into the dark night, what he sees right outside of his property was so terrifying that for a second, Joao couldn't even breathe. And he just stood there staring at this thing, and then he tried to put his hands up to protect himself, but it was already too late. If you've made it this far into today's story, then I think it's safe to assume that you enjoy my style of storytelling, which boils down to true, strange, dark, and mysterious tales with a big plot twist or reveal at the end. And if I'm right in thinking that, then I have a surprise for you. In addition to the hundreds of stories you can listen to right here on this YouTube channel, you can also find over 100 other stories on our podcast, many of which are not on YouTube. They are exclusive to the podcast. The podcast is called the MrBallen Podcast, and on Mondays we put out those brand new exclusive podcast stories, and on Thursdays we put out the remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Go listen to all 100 plus MrBallen podcast episodes available exclusively on Amazon Music with your Prime membership. If you're not a Prime member, you can still listen to the MrBallen podcast by subscribing to Amazon Music Unlimited in the Amazon Music app. Download the app today. Okay, back to the story. Minutes later, Joao would come stumbling out of his front door, out into the dark night. He's got a big blanket wrapped around him, and he was just screaming incoherently. And as he screamed all this nonsense, he began running in this kind of zigzag pattern with no clear destination in mind. It was just like this mindless running all through the village. And as he's running, he's got no shoes on, and he's stepping on sharp rocks and glass and trash. He's cutting his feet up horribly, but he doesn't seem to even notice. And so as he's doing this, he's causing this huge scene, but everybody's gone. It's a ghost town. It's just him in this abandoned village in the middle of a rainforest in Brazil. But eventually, Joao kind of calmed himself down and ran to his sister's house, Marie, because he noticed there was a lamp on inside of her house, and he was hoping that maybe she too had stayed back from the festival. And it would turn out Marie had not gone to the festival. She too did not really like big gatherings like that, and so she was home. And so Marie was in her kitchen when she began hearing outside this horrible screaming sound, almost guttural sounds coming from someone or some animal out there. And then before she could even figure out what it was, she heard this loud thud against her door. Marie was terrified and she ran to her front window to look out and see what it was that had just collided with her door. And what she saw made no sense. It was her brother, Joao, but he was wrapped in that big blanket and his feet were all bloody and he was screaming at the top of his lungs, but he wasn't saying anything. He was just kind of babbling. And so Marie was about to run over and open the door for her brother. But right before she did, as she's looking out the window, Joao turned and looked at her. And when he did, she screamed because his eyes looked so alien. They were wide and totally unfocused. And she thought, that can't be my brother. What's wrong with him? But she would go over and open the door because after all, it is her brother. And so she opens the door. Joao kind of falls into the room and began writhing around on the ground, continuing this scream he was emitting that didn't even seem human. And the whole time, Marie is trying to ask him, what's wrong? What's going on here? She's scanning him. And besides the cuts all over his feet, he didn't appear to have other injuries. And so eventually Marie just knelt down and she was about to grab Joao and try to kind of stop him from moving around, to just look at him and try to have a conversation with him. But before she grabbed him, Joao rolled over and his lips opened up, exposing his teeth. And he kind of grimaced at her with those wild, unfocused eyes. And again, Marie just kind of backed up in horror. Who is this? What's happened to my brother? And as Marie stood up to get away from Joao, Joao, still with that sickening grin with his teeth exposed, had this kind of low hiss come out of his mouth. And so Marie, thinking he was trying to talk, she leaned in, and through this hiss, she heard him repeating, "It burns, it burns." And so Marie, thinking her brother must have been burned, instinctively began removing the blanket and pulling his clothes off to find the source of this burn on her brother. But besides the cuts all over his feet, as she's looking at his body, his skin looked totally normal. He looked completely unhurt. And so Marie turned up to look at Joao's face again to ask him more questions in hopes maybe he could tell her something. And it was at that moment she noticed that even though he didn't seem to have any other injuries, his complexion on his face was now starting to change. Now, Joao's cheeks had turned this kind of dark purple and almost looked like they were starting to swell. And so at this point, Marie knew, okay, I can't handle this. I don't know what's going on here. And so she would stand up and just kind of back away from Joao, who's still got that grimace with his teeth exposed and his purple cheeks. He's staring up at Marie. And Marie, she finally backs out and she goes out the front door and she begins running to the other side of town. Marie knew that there were two other men who had stayed home from this festival. It was the town sheriff and the town doctor, whose name was Arasi Gumiji. And those two men lived close together on the other side of town. And when Marie arrived in front of their homes and began pounding on their doors and yelling for help, the two men quickly came outside, at which point Marie tried to explain what was happening to her brother, but she didn't really have the words. And so she just said, "He needs your help." And so the two men just went with Marie and they ran back across town to Marie's house, where Joao was still on the ground, writhing in pain when they went inside. Marie had only been gone for a couple of minutes, but by now it wasn't just Joao's cheeks that had turned that purplish color. His chest and arms were also turning purple. At this point, the sheriff leaned over Joao and began asking him some questions, and Joao, he was obviously in horrible pain from something, but by this point he had calmed down enough to where he was speaking a little bit more. But what he was saying made no sense. He told the sheriff that he had been followed home and then he got burned. And when the sheriff asked him, "Who burned you?" all Joao could say was, "No one is to blame." At this point, the sheriff left Marie's house and jogged over to Joao's house to look for some sign of how he got burned. But when he got there, the house was completely unburned. Everything was exactly as it should have been. There was no scorch marks. There was not even a lit candle anywhere. So there was no clues as to what happened to Joao. By the time the sheriff got back to Marie's, it had been about 45 minutes from when Joao first got hurt. And now, whatever was happening to his body that was turning him purple appeared to be getting much worse. Joao's skin all over his face and his chest and his arms was now not only a very dark purple, but his skin was starting to blister and pop. In fact, there was one area on his arm that had bubbled up so much that when it burst, you could actually see the bone in his arm. It was almost like Joao had been boiled in water, like the way you would boil meat on a bone until the meat was tender enough that it fell off the bone. It was like that was happening to Joao. And so as Joao's flesh just sort of began cooking off of him, the town doctor, Arasi, said, "We have to get him to a hospital right now." But because the roads were not paved and it was dangerous traveling at night, they knew they couldn't get him to the big city hospital. They would have to take him to a local hospital. And so the sheriff, who had a truck, said, "Let's just put him in the truck and I will drive him there." And so Arasi, the sheriff, and Marie, they got a new sheet, they wrapped up Joao inside of it, and they brought him outside, they put him in the sheriff's truck, and they began driving towards the hospital. Arasi stayed in the back with Joao as they made this drive, and every time the truck went over a bump, Joao would let out a cry of pain, and Arasi would look over and he would literally see these bumps were causing his skin to kind of fall off of his body. When they finally arrived at the local hospital, the staff there pulled Joao inside, they put him in a private room, they put him on a bed, and they had no idea how to treat him. It was like his injuries looked nothing like they had ever seen. They didn't even know where to begin, and they kind of assumed that Joao would not survive whatever was happening to him. And so the first thing they did is just pumped him full of painkillers. And while these painkillers didn't actually do anything to stop basically Joao's body from decomposing while he was still alive, they did at least allow Joao to stop feeling this horrible pain of his flesh falling off of him. And so Joao finally just kind of sunk back in his bed, and the sight of him must have just been horrific. He literally had huge chunks of his flesh just missing. I mean, literally parts of his skeleton were exposed to the naked eye. After the doctors had gotten Joao as stable as they could get him, Arasi, the local town doctor, sat down next to Joao and just began asking him questions. And for the first time, Joao was able to talk somewhat normally because he was on such a high dose of painkillers. And so Arasi began asking Joao to go over everything that happened from the time he left fishing for catfish until he arrived at his house and got burned. This is roughly what Joao told Arasi. He said on his walk home from fishing, he started getting that feeling that he was being watched. And it got more and more intense as he got into town until finally he basically sprinted the rest of the way to his house, practically dove through that open window, shut it behind him, and expected to feel relief being in his own home again. But he didn't. The feeling only intensified that he was being watched. And at some point, he got that sense that whoever or whatever was watching him was to his left, out the window, out into his yard. And when Joao turned to look, what he saw standing outside was this dark figure kind of hovering over the ground, and it was staring right at Joao. And before Joao could even put his hands up to protect himself from whatever or whoever this was, this figure shot this bright ray of light directly into Joao's home through that window, which hit Joao in the chest and the face. And immediately Joao was blinded and confused by this light, and then it really started to burn. He believed he was on fire, which is why he grabbed that blanket and wrapped it around himself. He was trying to put out a non-existent fire, and that's when he stumbled outside and kind of zigged and zagged, kind of half trying to put this fire out until he arrived at Marie's house. But when he got there, that sensation of feeling like he was on fire didn't go away. It just got worse and worse and worse, and then his skin began falling off. When Arasi asked Joao, who do you think did this to you? Who do you think that figure was? And Joao, with bulging eyes, would sit forward and say to Arasi, "It wasn't of this world." And as Joao said this, a chunk from his cheek fell off, exposing his jaw and teeth. And as this happened, Joao asked one of the nurses for a water. And so Arasi is sitting there having heard this story as Joao, who's all hopped up on painkillers, is grabbing this water and drinking, and Arasi is watching the water dribble out of the hole now on the side of Joao's face. About 4 hours later, Joao would pass away from his injuries. There has never been any official explanation for what actually happened to Joao. The doctors just wrote cardiac arrest and generalized burns on his death certificate because they really had no idea what else to call this. Joao's family believed the boitata, the ancient serpent that lived in the forest and appeared at night in a ball of fire, was responsible for what happened to Joao. Other people in town thought maybe it was the monsters or demons from the old abandoned mine that had come out and attacked Joao. Outside of Joao's town, people have theorized that Joao must have been subjected to some really high dose of radiation. And so this theory has led people to believe that, perhaps Joao was the victim of a secret weapon that the government was testing. But to create such a concentrated beam of radiation that only affects Joao would be way more technologically advanced than anything that was available at the time in the world. Not to mention, why would any government randomly target a Brazilian farmer with this weapon? But Joao would not be the only person in Brazil to die from mysterious rays of light. In the 1970s, so 30 years after Joao's death, several people in a city in northern Brazil reported seeing bright lights coming down from the sky, and then they too began turning purple and their skin began falling off and they would die. And so because of this high number of very strange deaths that looked just like Joao's, a new theory has taken root over the years to explain what happened to Joao and these people. And that is, they were attacked by a UFO. That Joao, when he looked out the window and saw that dark figure hovering over the ground, that was a UFO, and the light he saw was a weapon. The UFO was firing a ray of radiation that struck him and killed him like it struck and killed the others in Brazil. The military actually looked into this theory in 1977 and 1978. It was called Operation Saucer, like flying saucer. However, officially, they came out and said they found no evidence that UFOs were in any way involved in what happened to Joao or these other people. However, many people are skeptical that we're really getting the truth. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please figure out which book the like button is reading currently, and when they're about halfway done with it, spoil the ending. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we put up the remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, the podcast is just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Español. We also put out near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those channels are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. To check out our merch, join our Discord server, or just see what's going on inside of Ballen Studios, head on over to our brand new website, ballenstudios.com. So whether I see you on Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. People are going missing all over North America under baffling conditions. In some cases, there are people where someone's looking right at them, they turn around, and then, moments later, they're gone. Or in some cases, people will go missing and then are found again in locations that are impossible to get to. And so one man named David Politis, who's a former police detective, began investigating these very strange disappearances because nobody else was. And he started compiling what he was finding in an absolutely fascinating book series called Missing 411. And so as I read through all of his books, I've begun pulling some of the more interesting cases that he details and highlighting them on this channel. Today, I'm going to focus on 4 instances of kids going missing after being in locked vehicles. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. If that's of interest to you, please throw the like button into the bottomless pit near Ellensburg, Washington, and also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On October 16th, 1930, John Sullivan, who was with his nephew, Lawrence Sullivan, who was only 3 years old, they were driving together in the middle of the Nevada desert. They were about 150 miles away from Reno in this very remote area. John was a gold prospector, and he was heading to an area that he wanted to scout out and see if it was a proper place to prospect for gold. This area, the roads didn't even go to it. You had to drive down this road where it just kind of dead ends in the middle of the desert, right near this huge steep mountain range, at which point you needed to park your car, get out, and then walk over this hill right in front of where the road ends, and it was going to be over that hill looking down into this valley where John wanted to prospect. So he drives down the road, he parks the car, and he turns to Lawrence and he says, "Hey, I'm going to go over this hill for a minute and check the area out. I'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Stay in here, don't leave the car, I'll be right back." John gets out, he locks the car, he walks up to the top of the hill, and he turns around, looks at Lawrence, and waves at him. Lawrence looks up at his uncle and he waves back, and he's smiling. So clear interaction. Lawrence knows where John is and where John's going. John can clearly see Lawrence. There's no one in the area too. I'm talking, this is remote as remote can be. You're just right up against this mountain. That's the only thing going on in this area. So John turns his back on Lawrence. He goes over the hill. He's now out of sight of the vehicle, and he does a short inspection of this area that he wanted to prospect. He goes back up over the hill, and he sees immediately that the door is now open and Lawrence is not in the vehicle anymore. John is not immediately concerned because it's only been a couple of minutes. He can't have gone very far, and there's nowhere to even go. There's no trees. I mean, basically it's just this mountain right here, but beyond the mountain, there's really nowhere to go. So he goes down, he looks in the car, he looks under the car, he's yelling for Lawrence, no response. And sound carried really well in this area. After a little while, and he can't hear anything, he hasn't seen Lawrence, he's starting to get very desperate because they are in the middle of nowhere, and the temperatures are going to drop well below freezing at night. So John has to make this totally painful decision to get in his car and drive and get help. And so he leaves Lawrence because he can't find him. He gets help. The sheriff comes out there and they start this massive search for this child. This whole time, John is convinced someone had to abduct him because Lawrence knew where John was. If he was to get out of the vehicle, let's say, he would have walked over the hill to where John was. John was just on the other side of the hill. It doesn't make any sense that Lawrence would get out and wander in a different direction. He would have gone to John. They were very close. He might have wanted to see what he was doing on the other side of the hill. In the first few days of the search, they can't find any tracks of the child or another person that could have potentially abducted him, or even tracks of an animal that could have potentially taken Lawrence away. There's just nothing. They did find his hat, but that was it. There's no other evidence to go off of. And so after 4 days of searching, the newspapers began running headlines about potentially an eagle swooping down and taking Lawrence away, because that's all anyone could speculate given the fact that there was no tracks anywhere and that his hat had fallen off. At this point, the police feel totally helpless. They don't understand how this child has managed to evade capture. They're not ready to accept that an eagle has taken him away. And so the police bring in a Native American tracker who was known in the area as an exceptional tracker. So this tracker comes in and manages to pick up a partial trail of this child. And he starts following it, and they get 7 miles away from where this boy went missing. And the tracker begins going up the side of this cliff. They have to actually bring in climbing equipment to get up this cliff. They go 1,400 feet up this cliff. So over 400 meters, they're going up this sheer cliff with climbing equipment. And they get all the way up there, and there's this one little shelf, this one little rocky shelf that this tracker has brought them to. And sure enough, on this shelf is Lawrence, and he's more or less unharmed. He's sleeping, but he's on this little shelf. He's tucked up against this tree. But interestingly, the tree had this bough that was fairly elastic, and it had clearly been placed over his neck, basically trapping him tight up against the mountain. It was like he had fallen into a trap, because the police said that had he moved suddenly, he would have broken his neck the way he was positioned. So the police carefully undo the branch, And they bring the boy down, which was a total task considering how far up they were. And he's unharmed. He's a couple scratches on his face, but that's about it. They have no idea how he, one, got 7 miles away and then over 400 meters up a sheer cliff. So 1,400 feet up a sheer cliff that adults needed climbing equipment to get to. And then how did you survive the below freezing temperatures? You were out here for nearly a week. Nobody knows. On October 19th, 1973, James and Carol Duffy decide they want to go camping. So they have this big RV camper and they load up their 2 kids, Jimmy, who was 2, and Natalie, who was a little over 1 year old. They load them in the RV along with their 2 cats, and they take off for Lake Wenatchee, which is in the state of Washington. It's this beautiful campsite where lots of people with RVs would park right up against this lake. So they make it to Lake Wenatchee, they park their RV, they all get out, they're going on a little walk, but the kids seem fussy, and so Carol and James decide to put them down for a nap. Carol takes the kids inside the RV, she puts them down for a nap. They're in there with the 2 cats. She shuts and locks the RV and goes outside. At this point, James says he wants to go scout for a good hunting spot around where they were camping. And so James takes off and he's looking for a place to go hunting. And Carol decides she's going to walk a little ways around the lake, but keeping an eye on the RV the whole time. And also James was within eyesight of the camper as well. And after about 15 minutes, James goes back to the camper and checks on the kids. Carol would say she saw James doing that and kind of looked over to get the thumbs up from James to make sure the kids are okay. James goes in, the kids are sleeping, the cats are sleeping. James comes out of the camper, he shuts and locks it. He turns and he sees Carol. She's about 100 meters away, so a little over 300 feet away. He gives her a thumbs up and then actually walks over to her. So he's gonna go walk around with his wife now. So he makes it over to Carol and they're walking a little bit farther away. So they're still only about 150 meters away from their camper when they hear a scream coming from their camper. When they both turned around, there was a big tree kind of obscuring their view to the camper. So they kind of ran back on the path to get a better look at their camper. And all they can see is the door to the camper is now open. So the 2 of them sprint over to the camper. James gets there first, he goes inside, and his son, Jimmy, is gone. Their youngest child, Natalie, was still sleeping, and their 2 cats were still sleeping. Remember, Carol and James were on the other side of this lake about 100 meters away when they heard this screech coming from the RV. It seems odd that the cats and Natalie wouldn't wake up to that, but they didn't. After an initial frantic search of the area where they can't find Jimmy or any sign of Jimmy, they call the police, they show up, and they begin doing a search themselves. And after 2 hours of aggressively combing this whole campsite and talking to all the other people that were there wasn't that many people there, so they were able to interview everyone, and everyone had an alibi. No one was near their camper. The police start to feel really suspicious about Carol and James. And in fact, they straight up accuse James of hurting his child and trying to cover it up. But James and Carol swear they were on the other side of the lake there, they heard that scream, they ran over, this is what we found. And so for 4 days, there's this massive search with canines, helicopters, you name it. They are combing the area, they're interviewing everyone they can. There is nothing, no sign of this child. And so the suspicion that Carol or James had something to do with the disappearance of this child only grew. And so eventually both parents were subjected to a polygraph test and both stuck to their story and both passed. They had nothing to do with the disappearance of their child. They were telling the truth. The police still felt like there's something off here about these parents. They must have had something to do with this. And so they really dug into their backgrounds and the family backgrounds, talking to friends and family. And every single person in this family's circle and even outer circle said, no, they care about their kids. They would never harm Jimmy. But through their digging, one thing that did come up is that Jimmy was actually considered a very frail child that basically couldn't do anything without assistance. So between the polygraph test that rules out the parents as being potentially responsible, and now this information that Jimmy was this very frail child who's also 2, right? He didn't get up, open the camper, escape, and then evade this massive search effort. You know, that didn't happen either. So all you're left with is abduction. But the police, they basically cordoned off this whole site and were able to account for every single person that was in the park at any time while the Duffys were there. And every single person had an alibi and completely checked out. Eventually, the search for Jimmy was terminated, and to this day, almost 50 years later, we still have no idea what happened to Jimmy, where he went, and how he got there. Late at night on March 26, 1962, the Crawford family, who lived in Tennessee, noticed their 1-year-old was sick, so they wanted to take her to the doctor's office. Mr. and Mrs. Crawford hop in the car with their 1-year-old, and they bring along their 3-year-old named Faye. They drive to the doctor's office. Turns out the 1-year-old's going to be just fine. They give the kid some medication. They head back to their house, and when they pull into the driveway, Mr. and Mrs. Crawford turn around. The 1-year-old is awake, but the 3-year-old, Faye, is fast asleep. So the parents look at each other and they say, okay, we'll get the baby inside. We'll give Faye a couple more minutes to sleep inside the car, and then we'll come out and we'll get her. So Mr. and Mrs. Crawford carefully get the 1-year-old out without waking Faye up. They shut the door, they lock it, the windows are up. They go into the house, they put their 1-year-old down, and literally maybe a couple of minutes goes by. They come out and the doors are still shut, but Faye is gone. Now, because the vehicle was still shut, they're thinking, oh, she must have gotten out of her seat and maybe is tucked under the seats. So they run over and they look inside, and Faye's nowhere to be found. She's not in the vehicle. So the vehicle itself had only 2 doors. There was 2 rows of seating, but only 2 doors. If you were in the back seat like Faye was, you would need to push down, fold down one of the 2 front seats and then open that door to get out. But both door handles on the inside were broken off. They did not work. You would have to manually roll down a window and then reach outside the car and use the outside door handle to open either door. So the parents are looking at the vehicle, and the doors are shut, the windows are up, everything is still locked. And while it is possible that Faye could have, in theory, got out of her car seat, folded down one of the 2 front seats, rolled down a window, reached out, opened the door, got outside, rolled the window back up, pushed the lockdown manually, and then shut the door again, that is possible. It's extremely unlikely. And she had never done that. She'd never even gotten her own seat undone, let alone that complicated maneuver of getting out and reshutting the door and locking it. So obviously the police are called, they show up, they're searching the area, they can't find this child, and then it starts to snow and the temperatures start to drop. So the police and volunteers stay out all night. There is no sign of this child, and the Crawfords are bracing for the worst. The next day around 11 a.m., 3 miles away from where Faye went missing, she walks onto the property of someone's house. She was barefoot, but she was more or less okay. Obviously the parents are elated. They're so happy their daughter's okay. Now, normally when somebody goes missing, the investigation stays open until they're discovered. If they're discovered alive, even if the circumstances are really weird, because they're alive, it more or less ends the investigation, because what are you looking for at this point? They're found, they're alive, everything's okay. It's rare that an investigation would continue after they've been found. And in this case, the police left the investigation open because they couldn't understand how Faye could have gotten out of that vehicle, considering how difficult that would have been. And how did she get 3 miles away in less than 12 hours in the middle of the night walking through a forest? Not to mention, historically, kids are creatures of habit. If they're missing and they're in the middle of the woods, but it's nighttime, they don't just keep walking. They lay down and they go to sleep. And then when the sun comes up, they get up and then they keep moving. So for her to have gone 3 air miles from where she went missing to this farmstead, that means she did not lay down and go to sleep. She kept walking all through the night. So none of it added up. And then when they asked Faye what happened, she would just smile and laugh. That's all they could ever get out of this child. So despite leaving the investigation open, no one ever came to any sort of conclusion about how she got out of that car and how she covered that distance or why. It's just a big mystery, like all of these missing 411 cases. In 2001, Paul Wayment was 37 years old. He was a construction worker living in Salt Lake City, and he was about to get divorced for the 2nd time. In his first marriage, after the divorce, he got sole custody of their 4 children. He was a great father. The judge saw it that way and said the kids were better off with him. And following this second divorce, he would file for sole custody of the child that they had had together, who was a little boy, 2 years old, named Gage, and he would win. So Paul is a single father of 5 children. Gage was a lot younger than the other 4 kids, and so he kind of became Paul's little buddy and went everywhere with Paul. They were very, very close. On October 25th, 2001, Paul takes Gage, puts him in the back of his truck, he buckles him into his car seat, and the 2 of them head off to this area where Paul would hunt for deer. It was actually a private deer hunting area that was totally enclosed by a fence. Now, in order to access this private area, you needed to be a member, and Paul was a member, and once you become a member, they give you a gate code. And so Paul and Gage drive up, he gets to the gate, he punches in the code, he opens up the gate, the two of them drive in. He said he shuts the gate and locks it, and the two of them head up this path to this area where he planned to look for some deer. When he parked the car, he saw that Gage was passed out in his car seat and just did not look like he was going to be psyched to get out and go look for deer. Paul thinks about it for a minute and he decides, you know what, I'm going to leave Gage in the back seat. I'll just shut and lock the car. He's warm, he's taken care of. I'm going to go spend just a couple of minutes looking for deer and then I'll come back and I'll get him. So he hops out, he locks the car, and he walks a little ways away from the truck where it's still right behind him. But a couple of other hunters that were on this area, they saw Paul, they flagged him down, and they started talking. He gets preoccupied, and after 30 minutes or so, he realizes he needs to go back and check on his son. And when he goes back up, the front door on Gage's side is open, and Gage is gone. Paul runs up to the vehicle. He can't believe that Gage is gone. Paul screams for the other hunters to come over and help him. He's like, I can't find my son. They start looking in the area, and apparently Paul was so grief-stricken, he began vomiting. He was totally hysterical, and he kept saying, it's my fault. It's my fault. I left him here. Police show up, and this massive search is launched. But you got to remember that this is a gated-in area. Everything is locked. You need to have a code to get in here. And the only people that apparently were on this site at the time were the other hunters that Paul was talking to. And so obviously that casts a huge spotlight on those hunters and Paul being responsible for whatever's happened to Gage. But initially they just focus on looking for this child. And after a little bit of searching, and there's absolutely no sign of this kid, they do turn on Paul. He's like, you know what, if anything happened to my son, it's my fault. I left him in the vehicle, it's my fault. Like, he's not being defensive at all. He is 100% saying, it's my fault, I did this. He's not saying, I harmed my child, but he's taking full responsibility for whatever's happened. And the police pick up on that, and they're like, you know what, I think he's telling the truth. And he's also saying that he was with those other hunters, and they're the only other ones here. So for 4 days, this massive search is launched all over this hunting area, even beyond the hunting area, and there's no sign of this child. He's just gone. And so they terminate the search, but Paul's church offered to send another 150 volunteers to continue the search. And one of those volunteers was a man by the name of James Wilkes. He was an avid outdoorsman, and he brought along his dog, Dino. And over the course of this search, James and his dog actually get lost, which David Paulides says is very rare. There's so many people doing the search at one time, it would be hard to get lost, but it does happen. And so James and his dog wind up miles away from where they were supposed to be searching. They don't know where they are, they're lost. And so that night, the temperatures are dropping, it's snowing, and James and his dog ended up getting under a tree, in this little pocket under a tree, and they huddled together all night. And James said it was one of the worst nights of his life. He didn't sleep much, but at some point in the morning when the sun started to come up, he was happy to be alive. You know, he didn't die of hypothermia. And he and Dino start walking. And they've only walked a couple of minutes when the dog stops and he starts licking something on the ground. And he looks down, and under a couple inches of snow, it's the body of Gage. James scoops up the body, and for hours they start walking back kind of generally towards where he thinks he needs to go. He ends up finding a fence that he recognized. And since he was exhausted from carrying the boy, he placed the boy's body near a fence post that he knew he'd be able to recognize. And he and Dino made their way out to the search and rescue headquarters, told them where to find the boy's body, and they went back and they collected the boy's body. Now, because James is the one to find the boy, they immediately had to treat him like a suspect. They polygraphed him because you found the boy, no one else has found him, you're ways away from the search, but he passed his polygraph. James would say to police that when he found the body, there were all these tracks around the body. They looked like canine tracks, but they weren't Dino's, and he knows they weren't Dino's because he was holding onto Dino all night, and he hadn't been in this particular area the night before. So investigators are like, if there were other canine tracks all over that area, it means, one, we searched it, but if we searched it, why didn't they pick up on the boy who they're trained to smell? Or what animal was this? Did it have anything to do with why Gage is here in the first place? After the autopsy, it was determined that Gage died from hypothermia. His father was absolutely devastated. You know, he spent all this time at the site where his body was found. He created a shrine for his son. He was known to spend hours in his vehicle trying to figure out how his son got out of his seat and then made his way out that front door, something he had never seen his son do. he was just totally devastated, and he was ultimately charged with negligent homicide, and he pled guilty to it and was given 30 days in jail, but before his sentence was carried out, he took his own life. So like all cases that David Paulides covers in the Missing 411 series, we're left with a lot of questions, and unfortunately they may never get answered. But that doesn't stop us from speculating, so please go in the comments and give me your best theory as to what's going on. How are these kids getting outside of these vehicles and winding up in places that seem impossible to get to? Not only will I respond to all the early commenters, the best theory will get pinned at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you want to see more like it, please throw the like button into the bottomless pit near Ellensburg, Washington, and also please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username on both platforms is the same, JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion for this channel, please submit it on our subreddit, just called MrBallen. It's linked below. I read it every day, so if I intentionally use your story suggestion, I will absolutely credit you. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, I'm just incredibly thankful for your support. And until next time, guys, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, I'm going to be sharing 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I will share the pictures that are famously associated with them. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to install brand new hardwood floors in the like button's home, and on installation day, show up and remove all the old flooring, but then quit the job. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1987, 21-year-old Deanna Wild had just separated from her husband, and she was living with her 2 friends, Virginia and BJ McGinnis, who were both 54 years old. On April 2nd of that year, the trio decided to visit Big Sur, which is the very beautiful, but very steep and dangerous section of the Central California coastline. They pulled over at a particular cliff overlooking the water to take some pictures. Afterwards, as they were getting ready to go back to their car, Deanna wanted a closer look, so she stepped to the edge of the cliff where she lost her footing and she fell 500 feet to her death. It was ruled an accident, so investigating officers refrained from taking any on-scene photographs, accepting instead Virginia's photographs that she said she had taken right before it happened. Deanna's mother was unable to afford a funeral for her daughter, and so the only person she could think to ask to help her was a lawyer that went to the same church as her. His name was Steve Keeney, and Steve said, yeah, of course, I'll try to make some phone calls for you and see what I can do. And in doing so, he wound up learning about the case, about what happened to Deanna, and he discovered that her 2 friends, Virginia and BJ, had actually taken a life insurance policy out on Deanna the day before she fell off the cliff. And so Steve began digging into the backgrounds of Virginia and BJ, and he discovered that Virginia had a history of being around a high number of accidental deaths and suspicious fires, and that she had cashed in a whole bunch of life insurance policies. So all of a sudden, Deanna's death did not look accidental. Steve would become obsessed with the idea that the McGinnises were behind Deanna's death, but unfortunately, there was virtually no evidence to support that, because when she died, the investigating officers ruled it an accident. So there was no crime scene, there was no evidence collected, the autopsy was very cursory, and so Steve would spend 5 years building a case against Virginia and BJ, but at the end of those 5 years, it was a rock-solid case, and Virginia and BJ were arrested. During their trial, the real story of what happened to Deanna finally emerged. On that April day in 1987, the trio went to Big Sur, and they had lunch together, they had a picnic, and while they were eating, BJ slipped some of his prescription antidepressants into Deanna's drink, and so after lunch, the drugs were in Deanna's system, and she began to get very drowsy, to the point where Virginia and BJ had to literally hold her up. She was falling over, she was so tired. And so while Deanna's in the state, Virginia and BJ tell her, hey, let's go over to the cliffs and take some pictures. And so they walk over, Deanna's stumbling and BJ's holding her up, and they get to the edge of the cliff, and BJ turns around so the ocean's at his back, and he's propping up Deanna, and Virginia steps away and she takes their picture. And then right after that picture, BJ, while still holding Deanna, turned around to face the water and kind of carried Deanna right to the edge, and Virginia took one more picture of them facing the water. And then right after that picture was taken, BJ took Deanna and threw her off the cliff. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this case is that as soon as he threw her off, Deanna kind of came to and whipped herself around and managed to grab onto the cliff with her hands. And so she's literally dangling, holding onto this ledge like in the movies, begging to be pulled back up. And Virginia and BJ, instead of helping her back up, picked up rocks and bashed her hands until she fell off the cliff. Ultimately, it would be these last two pictures that Virginia took that got her and BJ convicted of killing Deanna, because these pictures clearly showed Deanna was impaired compared to the earlier pictures on the camera roll. And the only reason these pictures existed is because Virginia wanted a trophy from the killing, because she was actually an uncaught serial killer that went around killing people and cashing in their life insurance policies. One of her victims even included her own 3-year-old daughter. BJ would actually die during his trial. As for Virginia, she was found guilty and sent to jail for life. Here are the final two pictures that Virginia took of Deanna. On July 30th, 2016, Janice Stewart was at home in College Station, Texas, preparing for a wedding she was going to be photographing the following week. Her 34-year-old daughter, named Sunday Rowan, lived a few hours away in San Antonio, and she was planning to go with her to help her take these pictures. As Janice worked, her cell phone kept buzzing. Since sunrise, Sunday had been Snapchatting her photos of her and her husband Matt, who was also 34, as they got ready for their hot air balloon ride that day. 18 months earlier, Sunday had bought Matt the tickets as a birthday gift, but the trip kept getting delayed because of bad weather. But on this July morning, the weather had cleared up and the trip was finally happening. Sunday and Matt often sought adventure to balance the demands of their jobs. Matt was the chief of clinical trials at the Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio and was a rising star in the field of burn research. Sunday worked at Crazy 8, which was a kids' clothing store, and she was devoted to her young son from a previous relationship. At 6:58 that morning, Janice received an image of the balloon's ground crew prepping the wicker basket that would hold her daughter, her son-in-law, and the rest of the other passengers. Around 7:30, Janice received another image. This one was a selfie of Sunday and Matt posing inside of the wicker basket. They were up in the air. There's a beautiful field below them. They're smiling and they're hugging. After that, the messages stopped. 10 minutes later, at 7:40, 85-year-old Buddy Miller was making breakfast in his ranch when he heard two loud explosions. The first one actually rattled his house. When he looked out the window, he saw this massive plume of black smoke on another rancher's land off in the distance. Alarmed, he jumped in his pickup truck and raced past his cows to the blaze a half-mile away. Commotion like this rarely occurred in Maxwell, Texas, a quiet rural community about 40 miles south of Austin. At her home just up the road was 66-year-old Margaret Wiley, who heard the explosions too. She said the first one reminded her of the sound her 20-gauge shotgun made. When she stepped onto the porch, she heard the second explosion, and she said it sounded like a loud pop, followed by a whooshing sound, like the sound a gas stove makes when it ignites. When she looked out towards where the sounds had come from, she saw this massive fireball explode in the distance, and she immediately called 911. When Buddy and the other first responders arrived at the scene, they saw this huge fire at the base of a power line tower, and at first they couldn't figure out what was actually burning. They heard the sound of hissing propane tanks and thought maybe it was a tractor or a baler that had caught on fire. But upon closer inspection, they saw a wicker basket and they saw bodies. This was a hot air balloon accident. It would turn out the pilot of that hot air balloon was 49-year-old Skip Nichols, and he had elected to fly that day despite a low cloud cover that had grounded the other hot air balloon companies in the area that morning. Also, Skip was on a mixture of prescription and over-the-counter drugs that impaired his ability to fly the balloon safely. After being in the air for 8 miles above the clouds, Skip decided it was time to land, and so he blindly descended through the clouds and he immediately hit a power line. An arc carrying 340,000 volts of electricity cut the balloon's metal support cables like a torch. As soon as the basket began plummeting toward the earth, the fuel lines disconnected from the burners overhead, spraying liquid propane up into the burners and then arced back down into the wicker basket, immediately engulfing the entire thing in flames. The burning basket fell over 100 feet to the ground. By 10 a.m. that morning, Janice had still not heard from her daughter after that last text she sent, which included the picture of her and Matt, that selfie image up in the balloon, and Janice was concerned that something had gone wrong. So she turned on the TV, and the first thing she sees is hot air balloon crash in Texas, no survivors. And on the screen, she immediately recognized the smiley face that was on the balloon that had crashed, because she recognized it from the images her daughter had sent her. Even before she got the official call, she knew instinctively that her daughter and her son-in-law were both gone. Here are the final pictures taken of Sunday, Matt, and the other 14 people who were on board that balloon. On September 25th, 1978, a Pacific Southwest Airlines Boeing 727 jet airliner entered San Diego airspace. Like all PSA aircraft, Flight 182 had a whimsical black button nose and smiley face painted underneath the cockpit. These so-called grinning birds were synonymous with the company's self-promoting ad campaign about them being the world's friendliest airline. But the airline was often criticized for being too friendly with their super low airfares, their kind of comic banter that the captains would employ through the intercom to passengers, and their female flight attendants who wore miniskirts and were instructed to make nice with the male passengers. Because the weather was clear, air traffic control directed Captain McFerrin and First Officer Fox to switch from instrument flight rules to visual flight rules procedures and to begin their final descent. Visual flight rules refers to pilots using their eyes to guide the plane. It's done when they're flying low, the weather's clear, and they can see the ground. At 8:59 a.m. that morning, as PSA Flight 182 descended down to 4,000 feet, air traffic control advised them of a Cessna, which is a small plane, that was ascending in their direction. Fox responded that they saw the Cessna, and so air traffic control came back and said to maintain visual separation. Maintain visual separation meant that despite ground radar-based controllers who could provide vertical and lateral separation criteria, the burden for maintaining separation fell solely on Captain McFerrin and his crew. In layman's terms, air traffic control was telling them, don't lose sight of the Cessna. Inside the Cessna was a flight instructor named Martin Casey and his student, who was a United States Marine named David Boswell. As this little plane ascended, air traffic control informed them that PSA 182, who was right in front of them and slightly above them, they were on their descent. However, they had the Cessna in sight. As a result, the men inside of the Cessna did not take it upon themselves to actively begin looking for this jet. They assumed the pilots of PSA 182, who had them in sight, would avoid them. Back in PSA 182, there seemed to be some confusion in the cockpit. The two pilots were debating whether the Cessna they were watching fly lower than them, past them on the right, was the same Cessna that air traffic control had told them about. And at some point they agreed, yep, that's got to be the same Cessna. And so they called in to air traffic control that it looks like the Cessna has passed us. They've flown past us on the right. Immediately after this transmission, the black box recorded the two pilots talking to each other, basically trying to convince the other that yes, that was definitely the right Cessna. But after a couple of minutes of reassuring themselves, one of them says, boy, I hope that was the right Cessna. According to later testimony by the air traffic controller who was in communication with the pilots of PSA 182 as they were on their final descent, he would say when Captain McFerrin came over and said the Cessna has passed him on the right, he believed him and he didn't think to check to make sure it was the right one. But in reality, the Cessna that McFerrin and Fox had seen was the wrong one. The real Cessna they were supposed to maintain visual separation with, the one containing Casey and Boswell, was still ascending in the direct flight path of PSA 182, except now this Cessna is in 182's blind spot below their nose, so they literally can't see each other. At 9:01 that morning, air traffic control got an alarm that PSA 182 and this Cessna are about to collide, but for some reason the air traffic controller did not alert both aircraft. Instead, this controller only contacted the Cessna and didn't tell them this was a dire situation. They said, hey, there's traffic in your vicinity, but I'm pretty sure it's just PSA 182 and they already see you, so you're fine. So Casey and Boswell inside of the Cessna just continued to ascend. 1 minute later at 9:02 a.m., PSA 182 flies directly over the Cessna and strikes them with their nose wheel. The Cessna gets hooked by the wheel and flips upside down and gets trapped underneath the right wing of the jet. Seconds later, the Cessna splits in two. The tail section containing David Boswell plummets to the earth like a rag doll. The nose section of the Cessna that contained Martin Casey stayed trapped underneath the right wing for a few seconds before it detonated. Inside of PSA 182, this explosion was deafening, and immediately after it, McFerrin was recorded saying, easy baby, easy baby. Then he asks Fox, what's the damage? And Fox says, it's bad, man, we're hit. Despite trying to keep the plane flying level, it lurched forward into an unrecoverable nosedive, and McFerrin, knowing they were doomed, calmly calls out to air traffic control and says, we're going down. Air traffic responded, okay, we'll have the equipment ready for you. Then the black box recorded the sound of a stall warning inside the cockpit, and as the aircraft streaked at over 300 miles per hour straight towards the ground, McFerrin's last known transmission to air traffic was, this is it, baby. Seconds before impact, McFerrin gave his final command over the intercom, which was, brace yourselves, and then right before the black box cut out, someone in the cabin yelled, I love you, Mom. At 9:03 a.m., PSA 182 slammed nose first into the ground just outside of downtown San Diego in an area called North Park. The resulting explosion of thousands of gallons of jet fuel sent a shockwave that was registered 2 miles away. Almost immediately, firefighters were rushing towards the rising mushroom cloud of black, oily smoke, and many of the first responders that arrived at the crash site in those first few hours were deeply disturbed at what they saw. The bodies that had not been destroyed in the explosion had gotten trapped up in the trees. All told, 144 people were killed in this accident. 135 were from PSA 182, 2 were from the Cessna, and 7 were just unlucky people that were standing on the ground in North Park. Following a 1-year investigation into the mid-air collision, it was determined that the flight crew of PSA 182 was found to be primarily responsible because there was that moment that was picked up in the black box where the two pilots were unsure if the Cessna that passed them was the right one, but instead of calling that into air traffic control and getting confirmation, they blew it off. The morning of the crash, a San Diego photographer was at a press event when he heard the explosion overhead, which was 182 colliding with the Cessna, and he began taking pictures, and he captured these now 2 infamous photos of PSA 182 seconds before they hit the ground. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer to install brand new, beautiful hardwood floors at the Like Button's house. And on installation day, remove all of their original flooring and then quit the job. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. In order to appreciate today's story, I actually have to give something away right now. And that is the main character survives. The reason I have to tell you that is because during this story, there is a really intense event that happens, and I use really specific descriptions for how something looked, how something felt, how something smelled, and if you didn't know I was pulling that from the survivor who lived to tell the tale, you might think I was just making it up, but I'm not. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button asks you to pick up some cereal for them, say yes, and then go to the store and buy the big single biscuit shredded wheat cereal. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On July 19th, 2013, 49-year-old Matt Dyer climbed on board a tiny 19-seat Twin Otter airplane that was parked on the tarmac of the Montreal International Airport in Canada. Matt was about to take off on the first of 2 flights that would take him and 7 other adventurous people deep into one of the most remote and wild regions in North America. For Matt, this trip was going to be the most amazing journey of his life. He had seen the ad for this 2-week-long expedition about a year earlier when he was looking through a magazine put out by an environmental organization called the Sierra Club. Now, even though Matt was a lawyer, he didn't make much money. He lived in this tiny town in central Maine where he made a living by offering either free or very low-cost legal assistance for some of the state's poorest residents. But Matt was an avid outdoorsman, and when he saw the opportunity to explore one of Canada's newest national parks that was so far north it was practically in the Arctic Circle, he decided the hefty $6,000 price tag was well worth it. 2.5 hours later, after flying over 900 miles due north away from the airport in Montreal, the Twin Otter airplane that Matt and the others were riding on touched down on a narrow gravel landing strip situated between this huge forest on a mountainside and a river on the other side. After climbing off the plane with all of their equipment, Matt and the 7 others hustled their way over to this stretch of flimsy plywood buildings that lined the runway. These buildings and this entire area they were in was not a part of this new national park they were going to. This was like their staging area to prepare and get ready before catching another flight that would bring them into the park. And so Matt and the 7 other people he was with, which included the 2 trip leaders from the Sierra Club, they would stay at this temporary base camp for the next couple of days, going over their hiking routes and talking about emergency procedures and protocols. And then after those 2 days were up, the group felt like they were ready. And so the group packed up all their things and they boarded the tiny float plane out on the water that would take them to their final destination, this new Canadian national park, better known as the Torngat Mountains. 45 minutes later, the pilot of the float plane began to descend through the clouds to make their landing on a little water inlet. And as the pilot did that, Matt and the 7 others were able to look out the window and actually see the Torngat Mountains for the first time. Now, all of them had seen dozens and dozens of pictures of this area, but seeing it for the first time in person was still shocking. The area looks like an alien planet. The wilderness in and around the Torngats is not the same kind of wilderness we think of when we think about going hiking in the forest or going camping or something. No, the wilderness in the Torngats is primordial. It's like you're looking out at a place from the very beginning of time, like dinosaurs should be walking around this area. As far as Matt could see, in any direction were these huge, jagged mountains that had been carved out of the earth by glaciers hundreds of thousands of years ago. And those same glaciers had created hundreds of waterways between the mountains called fjords that almost looked like blue-veined fingers. And even from high up in the plane, Matt could look down and the water of these fjords were so clear that he could see these speckled backs of brown trout swimming beneath the surface. But while this landscape was undoubtedly spectacularly beautiful and pristine and totally incredible, it was equal parts unwelcoming to people. There are no roads in the Torngats, there's no campsites, there's no facilities, there's no internet, there's no cell phone, and the weather is unbelievably harsh. It's freezing cold and wet most of the time, and then even when it's a little bit warm and a little bit nice there, the weather can change in an instant and become freezing cold and wet all over again. And so, as such, the handful of visitors that go into this area every year are expected to be 100% self-reliant, because this really is one of the most dangerous wild regions in the world. But for Matt, as he looked out his window and surveyed this landscape, he wasn't second-guessing his decision to go into this hostile environment. No. I mean, the reason he was willing to fork over all that money to go on this trip is because he really wanted to experience extreme wilderness firsthand. And so finally, the pilot of the float plane came into land on this little water inlet, and then the pilot ferried the craft over to this beach, and then Matt and the 7 others piled off onto land with all of their things, and then as the pilot turned around and left, the 2 Sierra Club trip leaders, a 61-year-old man named Rich Gross and a 60-year-old woman named Marta Chase, told the group to pick up their things and follow them. And so Rich and Marta led the hikers about 500 feet away from where they had just been dropped off, up to this slightly elevated, mostly flat area that kind of overlooked the fjord and had this incredible view of all the mountains around them. Now, unlike the temporary base camp they had been at for the past couple of days, this camp was nowhere near any forests. They were basically on a wide open plain that kind of went right up into these mountains. So it's very wide open where they're staying. And so after Rich and Marta instructed the group where to set up their tents, Matt and the others got to doing that. And then after they were all set up, Rich and Marta put a small electric fence around the perimeter of their tents to keep any nosy animals out. And then the group headed up a little bit higher on this mountain near them to take their first group photo. And in this photo, they all looked so happy and so excited for what's to come. And over the next couple of days, their trip would go exactly to plan. During the daytime hours, they would hike all of their pre-planned hiking routes all over the mountains and down near the water. And at night, they would eat their food and drink fresh water from the fjord and swap stories from back home. But their perfect trip was about to become a nightmare. I've been married to my wife, Amanda, for nearly 12 years, and I just love her so much. She's so thoughtful, so kind, an amazing mother, and so this Christmas, I wanted to get her something extra special to show her how much I care. And what's more special than a pet, middle-aged rabid skunk? And so me and old Lungy hopped on my nuclear-powered laptop and began slapping away at the keys to navigate to an online vendor that sold rab skunks. But as soon as I clicked on the link, www.WeSellRabbitSkunksAndAlsoPudding.com, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. That website was riddled with malware, and so immediately my laptop began to melt down and literally exploded. Luckily, Lungy shielded me from the blast, and then after the nuclear winter had subsided, Lungy put on... And then after the nuclear winter had subsided, Lungy put on his traditional gakti, and he said, Lopeta uden drayekeshen, ayutaninen, rokeshta roidi NordVPN. Which of course in Finnish means, stop causing nuclear explosions. Sign up for NordVPN. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that keeps you safe while you browse the internet. And NordVPN is the brand name in the space. Not only will NordVPN keep all of your information safely behind their wall of next-generation encryption, but also, most importantly, they will block malware hosting websites along with annoying ads and botnet control. So, if you're tired of your Christmas shopping turning into nuclear explosions, then take Lungy's advice and sign up for NordVPN today. Right now, you can get a 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus 4 additional months for free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen. And it's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/MrBallen, or click the link in the description below. Okay, back to the story. In the early evening hours of Tuesday, July 23rd, so 2 days after the group arrived in the Torngat Mountains, Matt and the others returned from one of their hikes. Now, the day had been cold and rainy, but the group was in good spirits. This was their last day at this particular camping spot. The next morning, they were going to pack up and head farther inland to their next camping spot. After Matt and the others had put their gear back inside of their tents, they came back out to see that Rich and Marta, the two trip leads, had organized a special feast for the group to celebrate the successful beginning of their trip. And so the group all sat around eating salami and crackers and drinking rum mixed with lemonade as they talked excitedly about the next couple of days and what they could expect. At some point during the festivities, Matt was tired, and so he broke away from the group. He climbed back inside of his tent, got inside of his sleeping bag, and before long, he was fast asleep. A few hours later, around 3:30 in the morning, Matt suddenly woke up. He had no idea what had woken him up, and so for a second, he just lay there listening to the outside world and just kind of staring straight up. Now, the moon was out that night, so there was some illumination, and as he looked straight up at the underside of his tent, he sees this huge figure move across the side of his tent and then stop right on top of him. And then before Matt's brain could process what was happening, this huge figure began pressing down on the fabric of Matt's tent. And so he's seeing his tent collapsing in on him. Matt's not doing anything. He's not saying anything. He's just watching in horror. And then suddenly the tent rips open and these two arms reach into the tent and they grab at Matt. And Matt threw his hands up in defense and screamed out for help. And as he did that, he suddenly felt this vice-like grip on the top of his head, and then before long, he was being pulled out of the hole in his tent out into the night. And as Matt is being dragged along on the ground, having no idea what's going on, he can't move. All he can hear is this crunching sound, which he would later find out was the sound of his skull and jaw breaking. And he started to smell this horrible rotten fish smell, and then he felt what felt like saliva coming over his face. And then Matt began kind of trying to look around because he couldn't really move his head, and he noticed all he could see was white fur. And it was then that Matt realized he was in the jaws of one of the world's most powerful and deadliest predators. Standing 10 feet tall on its hind legs and weighing as much as 1,700 pounds, the North American polar bear sits right on top of the Arctic food chain. And now this apex predator was dragging Matt by the skull down to the beach where Matt knew he would be eaten, even if Matt was still alive when the eating began. When the bear first ripped open Matt's tent and bit down on the top of his skull, Matt let out that scream, and it actually woke up the entire camp. And one of the first people to emerge from their tents to see what was going on was one of the trip leaders, Marta. And so she jumps out of her tent, and just 3 feet away from her, she sees this huge polar bear on its hind legs diving into the tent to get after Matt. And so Marta instinctively yells out to Rich to get his flare gun, and she dove back into her tent to retrieve her own flare gun. But by the time she and Rich had both emerged, gun in hand, this polar bear had already dragged Matt 200 feet away from the camp. And by this point, the other hikers in the group had also emerged from their tents, and after realizing what was going on, they just stood there, absolutely paralyzed with shock, staring at this bear dragging one of their companions down to the beach to be killed. Then, after Rich fired his flare gun generally in the direction of the bear, it kind of snapped the group out of their paralysis, and then moments later, they were all screaming and banging pots and pans to try to terrify the bear into releasing Matt from its jaws. Matt couldn't hear the sounds of his companions calling out to try to save him, nor did Matt feel any pain. He was in shock. The only thing going through Matt's head as he was being dragged along the ground to the beach was, I'm going to die. I'm either going to die on the way to the beach, or when I get there, then when the bear starts eating me, I'm going to die. And when he thought about this, it was with a kind of eerie, calm detachment. Like he wasn't sad or mad. It was just kind of a fact. This was going to happen. But as Matt was kind of making peace with his reality, Rich fired that flare gun shot, and that ball of chemical fire exploded basically right in front of the polar bear's face. And the polar bear, who was startled by the flare, instinctively whipped its head to the side, up, and then down again, and it didn't let go of Matt. And so Matt was whipped like a rag doll up and then was slammed down into the ground. And when Matt hit the ground, he heard the sound of his neck breaking. But as Matt was laying there, the bear released him from its jaws, and then behind Matt, the bear turned around and began walking away. And so Matt could hear the sound of its big paws moving away from him, and suddenly Matt's thinking, oh my God, I might survive this. And so he tried to lay as still as he possibly could so as not to attract any attention, and he began repeating in his head over and over and over again, please bear, go away, please bear, go away. But as if out of a horror movie, as Matt is laying there repeating this phrase, he hears the sound of this bear stopping, turning around, and start moving back towards him. And so Matt's just thinking, okay, it's going to come back over here, it's going to bite my head, and that's the end. But luckily, Rich, by this point, one of the trip leads, had run down closer to the beach, reloaded his flare gun, and right as this bear was going to bite Matt again, Rich had fired that flare, and once again, the chemical fire had kind of exploded right near the bear, causing it to get startled. It turned around, it ran off, and this time the bear did not return. It would turn out Rich and Marta, the two trip leaders from the Sierra Club, had chosen a location for this campsite that was so heavily trafficked by polar bears, it was referred to as a polar bear highway. When all of the hikers, which included Marta and Rich, had been given their safety brief when they were staying in those plywood structures at that base camp near the runway, well, part of the brief was whenever you make camp in the Torngots, you want to be at least a quarter mile away from water. Go way inland because the polar bears hunt and fish and walk around right along the edge of these fjords. But despite all 7 members of this Sierra Club expedition being experienced wilderness backpackers, none of them really appreciated just how dangerous it was to be camping or even hiking around in known polar bear territory. And so this is why they ultimately ignored the safety brief and set up their first camp just a couple hundred feet away from the water's edge. And even prior to the attack on Matt, when the group literally saw polar bears wandering around near their camp, and even at one point had to fire their flare guns at the polar bears to get them to leave, the group still decided it was best to stay at this particular campsite. Perhaps they believed their electric fence they had set up around the perimeter of their tents would protect them from these polar bears, but obviously that had not been the case. The bear that attacked Matt had been totally unaffected by their fence. Matt would survive this attack, but really only because one of the members of the expedition happened to be a medical doctor, and so they were able to stabilize Matt until help arrived. Matt's injuries were extensive. They included a broken skull, a broken jaw. He had slash marks and puncture wounds all over his head and his neck, and all of those wounds got horribly infected. And also his voice was permanently changed as well because the bear also slashed his vocal cords. Following the attack on Matt, Parks Canada, which is the agency that oversees all of Canada's national parks, including Torngots, has mandated that any organization going into Torngots National Park has to have a polar bear protection plan in place. As for Matt, he does not make a big deal about his near-death experience. In fact, he kind of makes light of it and sometimes even makes jokes about it. As for the polar bear that attacked him, Matt holds no ill will. If anything, the attack has made him more interested and appreciative of the apex predator. In August of 2014, so 11 months after Matt's brush with death, he returned to the Torngots and even visited the actual site of the attack, perhaps to get closure. Except this time, he was in the company of an armed polar bear expert. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button asks you to get them cereal, say yes, and then go to the store and buy the huge single biscuit shredded wheat cereal. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings we put out remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Espanol. We also post near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, I'm going to share 3 progressively more unbelievable stories, and at the end of each of them, I'm going to show you the photo that is famously associated with that story. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to refill the Like Button's Keurig coffee machine water tank, but instead of using water, use vinegar. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the evening of March 25th, 2017, a 25-year-old farmer named Akbar Solabiro was harvesting palm fruit at the local oil palm grove near his tiny village in Indonesia. Now, the way Akbar would do this is he would use this long curved pole and he would prod at the bright red fruit in the tree, knocking it to the ground, and then he would gather it up, put it in his cart, and wheel it back home to be sold for palm oil. Now, on this night, Akbar was actually working later than usual because his wife and kids were out of town for a couple of days visiting family, and so there was no real reason to head back home because the house was empty. But Akbar was actually just fine with that because there was tons of ripe fruit, and so staying late would be quite profitable. But after a while, when the sun had finally set and it was getting difficult to actually even see the fruit in the tree, Akbar knew he really needed to leave soon because this area at night was actually not safe. And so Akbar gathered up the remainder of his fruit on the ground, he put his pole in the cart as well, and he began quickly making his way back home. Later that evening, one of Akbar's neighbors was asleep in their bed inside of their home when they woke up suddenly to the sound of something out in the jungle, not far from where Akbar had been harvesting palm fruit. And so this neighbor, when they sat up, they couldn't really tell what the sound was. It almost sounded like a stifled scream or maybe some animal that was fighting with another animal. But as the neighbor sat there straining their ears to try to hear it again, they didn't. All they heard was normal sounds coming from the outside. And so the neighbor decided that the sound they heard must have been a cat or maybe a monkey, and whatever it was, it couldn't have been a big deal. And so this neighbor went back to sleep. The following evening, so 24 hours later, another one of Akbar's neighbors walked outside of their home to begin the walk over to the jungle to harvest palm fruit. And when they went outside, normally around this time, Akbar would be coming outside as well, because these two often went to the grove together. But, this neighbor is looking and Akbar's not outside, and he looks up at Akbar's house and it's dark and quiet. And so this neighbor's thinking to themselves, where is Akbar? I know he worked late last night. I didn't hear him come in. And come to think of it, I haven't seen him all day. And now, of course, I'm not seeing him as well. And so this neighbor, feeling concerned about Akbar, walked over and knocked on his door, but nobody answered. And so really starting to think that something could be wrong with Akbar, this neighbor went to Akbar's uncle's house. And when Akbar's uncle came to the door, this neighbor explained what was going on and they're concerned that, something could have happened to Akbar. And so the uncle and this neighbor would go back over to Akbar's home and they would actually try the door. It was locked. They looked inside the windows and it looked like no one was in there. And they also noticed that where Akbar typically kept his cart that he would transport his fruit in, it wasn't there either, which made them think, Akbar must still be out somewhere with this cart because this cart is very important to him. And so ultimately, the uncle, after seeing the state of his nephew's home, he agreed with this neighbor that, something was wrong here. And if they wanted to find Akbar, they really needed to get together a search party right now and go looking for him. So the uncle contacted the leaders of the village, and they in turn rounded up all the able-bodied men in the village, and they all got together with headlamps and flashlights and machetes and knives, and then all together they began walking away from the village into the jungle in the direction of this palm grove, which was the place that Akbar had been last. And so this big group of men, they get inside the jungle and they begin walking along this path, which was the most likely path that Akbar would have taken to go to the palm grove and also to return from the palm grove. And as they're walking, the sun is starting to set, it's getting dark, and the animals in the jungle, they're all making noises and kind of yelling at this group as they're moving through. And this group, they're shining their light around looking for any sign of Akbar, but there wasn't any. They were calling his name out, there was no response. And then at some point, as they got closer to the palm grove, they noticed there were a couple of bright red fruits, palm fruits, that had clearly been recently harvested that were scattered on the trail. And so the group began to fan out in this area, thinking that, oh my goodness, Akbar must be somewhere nearby. Maybe there was some sort of accident and he's fallen somewhere, or just something's happened to him, but he's got to be in this area. And so the group began fanning out off the trail, kind of hacking their way through all the underbrush. And then suddenly, one of the men, after he hacked through a particularly dense stretch of the jungle, he looked down and saw something and began to scream, and he raised his machete and began running forward. As far as we can tell, this is what happened to Akbar. The previous night, after Akbar had decided, it wasn't safe to be in the jungle at night, he needed to leave, and so he gathered up all of his things and he began walking along that path where the search party would find all that fruit scattered on the trail. And so he's walking along this path and he thinks he's alone, he thinks he's okay, but in reality, he wasn't. He was being watched and followed very closely from something up in the trees. And so as Akbar moved along, this thing was kind of trailing him and seeing what he was going to do. And then at some point, this thing up in the trees began moving its way down closer and closer to Akbar. It was a 23-foot long reticulated python. It was a massive snake. And this snake came down and launched an attack on Akbar, grabbing the back of his neck with its powerful jaws. And as soon as the snake clamped down on Akbar's neck, he let out a stifled scream, which was the scream that had woken up that other neighbor who sat up in bed wondering what that was. That was Akbar screaming out. But that was the only sound Akbar could make, because immediately the snake wrapped itself all around Akbar and squeezed him tight. And after crushing Akbar, breaking almost every bone in his body, the snake relaxed and then slithered off of Akbar. And so Akbar fell to the ground and was either dead or very close to death. And at this point, the snake opened up its jaws and positioned itself right in front of Akbar's head. And then it began kind of slithering itself forward, consuming Akbar head first. And the way pythons do this is they don't really chew on their victim. Instead, they kind of put their mouth over the top of whatever they're going to consume, and they kind of undulate and walk their bodies forward, driving the victim deeper and deeper into their body until they are completely consumed. And so the next night, when one of the members of the search party had gone off the trail and began hacking away and then saw something and charged after it with his machete, what he was seeing was the python, who very clearly had a person inside of its stomach. You could see the outline of the person. And so this search party member ran forward and hacked the snake, opened it up, and there was Akbar fully dressed and deceased inside of the snake. On the night of February 19th, 2022, a 41-year-old woman named Paula Ruiz was working the reception desk at a 4-star hotel in southern Mexico. It had been a long Saturday night with lots of tourists checking in and lots of confused tourists asking for directions or clarifications about things in the area. But it was finally nearing 11 p.m., which was the end of Paula's shift, and also things had calmed down near the reception desk. There wasn't much going on. And so Paula took a moment and grabbed her phone and checked it. And she saw there was a text message from her 19-year-old son saying he would be picking her up after work on his motorbike. And then just a couple of minutes later, Miguel, her son, actually walked in the front door of the hotel. He waved to his mom and said, hey, I parked my motorbike just down the street. Whenever you're ready, we can leave. And so Paula, she was very happy to see her son. She walked over, she gave him a kiss and a hug, and then she began gathering her things. Paula loved the fact that her son was totally comfortable driving around town with his mom on the back of his motorcycle. Other teenagers might think that was awkward, but not Miguel. But Paula knew her son absolutely loved his motorbike and basically was always looking for an excuse to ride it. And so very likely that was why he was so eager to give his mom a ride home. And so finally, after Paula had gathered up her things and said goodbye to her coworkers, she and her son walked out the front doors of the hotel and they began walking down the road and around the corner to where Miguel always parked his bike whenever he picked his mom up from work. However, when they turned the corner and looked at the spot where Miguel said he had parked, his bike wasn't there. Now, at first, Paula asked Miguel, are you sure you parked it here? Maybe did you park it farther down the road? But Miguel said, no, this is where I always park. I definitely parked it right here. And so Miguel became convinced that someone must have stolen his bike. That was the only explanation that made sense. But Miguel still had the keys to his motorcycle, which meant whoever had stolen it had likely hotwired it. And since that takes quite a bit of time to pull off components of the bike and kind of fiddle around with the wires to make it start, Miguel was thinking that, okay, maybe they're still in the area trying to hotwire it. Let's go look for them and get the bike back. Now, the city in southern Mexico where Paula and Miguel lived was called San Cristobal de las Casas, and it was a totally beautiful place surrounded by all these hills, but it was also a very dangerous place, full of lots of street crime and violence and gangs that used the area as a hotspot for drug trafficking. And so this is not really a good place to be walking around at night, let alone trying to chase down some bike thief. But Paula and Miguel, they knew this. They lived there. They understood the risks. And Paula especially, she knew that Miguel was going to go looking for this bike because he loved that bike. And so Paula didn't hesitate and said, okay, Miguel, let's go looking. And she figured at a minimum, she could take a video or a picture of the thief if they found them with the bike, and then they could give that to police, and then maybe they could track the person down if Miguel and Paula couldn't get the bike back that night. And so Paula and Miguel began running down these side streets, looking all over the place for Miguel's bike. And you got to picture some narrow alleyways with barely any lighting. I mean, this is a sketchy area. And so they're running around, and then finally they turn a corner and Miguel sees up ahead his distinctive yellow motorbike, and he sees some stranger is pushing it along. Clearly this person is pushing it away so they can hotwire it. And so Miguel and Paula begin charging down the road, and Miguel actually gets in front of this guy and stops him, and Miguel starts screaming at the guy to give him his bike back. And then Paula, she joins her son and she starts screaming at him as well and taking videos and pictures. And then as this is happening, another man on a motorbike came flying up behind Paula and Miguel. And as they did, Paula and Miguel heard the sound of the engine and they turned around, and all Paula saw was this young man holding a gun, aiming it at her son, Miguel, right at his chest. And so her motherly instincts kicked in and she leapt in front of her son, and then not knowing what else to do, she raised her phone and took a picture. And then seconds later, there was a loud bang, and then suddenly this guy who had been trying to steal Miguel's bike gave it up. He dropped the bike, he took off running down the road, and the gunman, he too turned his bike around and sped off down the road, leaving Miguel and Paula in the alleyway. Except Paula was on the ground because a second after she took that photo, the gunman had shot her in the chest. Paula would be taken to the hospital, but she would die the following morning, orphaning Miguel and his 3 siblings. However, the photo that Paula took of her killer seconds before he killed her was such a high-quality photo showing his face that just 2 days after her murder, police were able to use that photo to find the killer as well as his accomplice, and they were both arrested. If you didn't catch my live storytelling event last month on the official MrBallen Discord server, then you kind of missed out. Not only were the stories awesome, at least according to me, but we also temporarily broke Discord because of how many people were trying to watch the event at once. But don't worry, you can be a part of our next live storytelling event on Discord if you just join the MrBallen Discord server, which is completely free. All you have to do is click the link in the description of this video or click the link in any of my social media bios. Also, the MrBallen Discord server is not just a place for live events. It's also a place where I make all of our biggest special announcements, and this summer we have a couple of huge announcements. So if you want to hear those announcements, you gotta get on the MrBallen Discord server. Either click the link in any of my social media bios or click the link in this video's description below. Okay? Back to the stories. On the morning of February 25th, 2015, in a little house in the city of Cape Town in South Africa, a 17-year-old girl named Misha Solomon was packing up her homework in between bites of her breakfast. And as she did this, her mother, Lavana, walked into the kitchen with a big smile on her face, and she was holding up this beautiful red flowing dress. And immediately Misha knew what it was. Her mom had been making this dress by hand over the past couple of days. It was for a big school dance that was coming up, and she saw that it was now done. And so Misha, she put down her breakfast and her homework, and she rushed over to her mom, and she admired this gorgeous dress and thanked her mom for all the hard work and said it's absolutely perfect. And then from somewhere behind Misha, her father, who was still sitting at the table, kind of grunted out, "Hey, isn't that dress a little bit revealing?" And Misha and her mom kind of just rolled their eyes because they knew Misha's dad just loved his daughter and was very, very protective of her. And so basically anything she wore that wasn't full coverage was too revealing. And so Misha, after rolling her eyes, walked over to her dad. She gave him a big hug and a kiss, and she said, "Dad, don't worry about it. It's just fine." And so after that, Misha went back to her breakfast. She finished eating, she packed up her stuff, and then she gave her mom and her dad another hug and a kiss and said goodbye. And then she headed out the front door out to the road where her aunt was waiting in her car. As Misha's aunt drove her to school, like she did almost every single morning, Misha began to notice her aunt was acting kind of strange and constantly looking behind her and looking in her rearview mirror. And finally, Misha said to her aunt, "What's going on? What are you looking at back there?" And Misha's aunt would say, "I know this sounds crazy, but I'm pretty sure there's a white car that's following me. And in fact, over the past couple of days, I've seen what I think is this same white car following us anytime I'm driving you to school." And so Misha just turned around in her seat and looked out the back window, and she saw there were dozens of white cars on the road. So it was pretty difficult to tell which one her aunt was talking about. But as she's looking, none of the cars seemed suspicious. And so Misha turned back around and told her aunt, "I think you're just being paranoid. Nobody's following us. There's no reason to follow us." A few minutes later, Misha's aunt pulled up alongside the front of the school, and Misha said goodbye to her aunt. She thanked her, she hopped outside, and she rushed into the school. And then Misha made her way up to the hallway where her first class was, and as she was walking down the hallway, her best friend, Cassidy Nurse, was walking up the hallway in her direction. And so right away, Misha sees Cassidy, and she waves and smiles and begins walking towards her. But Cassidy gave Misha this kind of weird, lukewarm smile, and then quickly looked away from Misha, and then Cassidy turned and bolted into the nearest classroom. And so Misha just came to a stop and just looked at the doorway where her best friend has disappeared, and she starts thinking to herself, what's going on? Why did she do that? That was so cold. And then Misha began to think about the fact that actually, over the past couple of days, Cassidy had been acting really strange. It was like she was trying to avoid Misha, but Misha had no idea why. It wasn't like they were fighting. Normally, Misha and Cassidy were totally inseparable. They had met earlier that school year, and even though they were actually kind of far apart in age, Cassidy was in 8th grade and Misha was in 12th grade, it was like it didn't matter. It was like right away when they met each other, they had this special bond where they just had to be around each other all the time. They shared everything with each other. And certainly anytime they saw each other in the hallway, they would stop to chat or even go into a nearby bathroom and do each other's hair and makeup and share any gossip they had recently heard. So for Cassidy to act like this was just totally uncharacteristic, and it really upset Misha. But just then, the bell rang in the school, so Misha knew at this point she was now late for her class, and so she had to forget about whatever was going on with Cassidy, and Misha just hustled down the hallway and went into her classroom. And so Misha, she takes her seat at her desk, she puts her stuff down, and she's getting ready to listen to the teacher, when suddenly the principal comes in without even knocking, and without even saying anything to Misha's teacher, the principal walks right up to Misha and says, "I need you to come with me." And right away, Misha's classmates, all who saw this, they begin oohing and awing as if Misha is in huge trouble. But Misha's thinking to herself, I didn't do anything. Like, I have no idea what this is about. And so she kind of smiled like it was no big deal. She picked up her stuff and she followed the principal out into the hallway. But as Misha followed the principal down the hallway towards the principal's office, Misha's smile faded and she began to wonder, what is this about? What's going on? And then finally, they got to the principal's office. The principal opened up the door. Misha went in first, and the principal trailed behind her and shut the door behind them. When Misha looked into the principal's office, she saw there were already two people inside who she didn't recognize. It was two women who were very serious looking, who were sitting on the side of the room. And as soon as Misha walked in, the two women, without introducing themselves, just told Misha to come over and take a seat next to them. And Misha, instead of doing that, just paused and looked at the women and said, "What's going on?" And at this, the two women kind of looked at each other, and then one of the women piped up and said, "Misha, we're here because the police sent us. And they sent us because of a photo that you and your very close friend Cassidy took." But before Misha could ask any questions like, what photo are you talking about and really what's going on here, these two women would explain the whole situation to Misha. And basically what they did is they told her this long, very convoluted story that involved Misha, it involved Cassidy, it involved this photo. And by the end of this story, this explainer story, Misha had taken a seat and put her hand over her mouth in utter disbelief. And then when the women were done explaining everything, Misha had a million questions, but it was like she was so overwhelmed with what she was just told that she just continued to sit there with her hand over her mouth, totally silent. And then finally, Misha did break the silence by saying, "Can I please just call my parents?" And at this, the social workers said, "No, you can't. And in fact, the police are already at your parents' house. They're talking to your parents right now. And so you can't talk to them and you can't even go home. In fact, you have to come with us for tonight." And then the two women got up and they made their way out of the principal's office and they said, "Come on, Misha, you have to come with us." And so Misha stood up and she's totally flabbergasted. She really is like, how is this real life? And the principal at this point walked over and gave Misha a hug. And it was like suddenly the floodgates opened and Misha just began sobbing hysterically. And as she did, the social workers just stood there waiting patiently. And then as soon as it seemed like Misha was done crying, they said, "Come on, you really need to come with us." And so Misha, she let go of the principal and she followed the two women out of the school out to one of their cars. And once they got in the car, the two women explained to Misha that they were going to take her to a safe house for the night. But before they went to the safe house, they would need to make a quick pit stop at a local medical clinic. And so Misha, who at this point is not even asking questions, just said, okay. And so the women, they drove to the medical clinic. They were inside for just a matter of minutes. When they came back out again, they drove the rest of the way to the safe house. And when they got to the safe house, it just looked like a normal house on the outside. But on the inside, when the two women were leading Misha through and showing her where everything was, the kitchen, the bathroom, her bedroom, all Misha saw was all these other kids who were staying there, who were orphaned and abandoned. And it started to give Misha a panic attack. And she asked the women again, "Can I please call my parents?" And they said, "No, you really can't." But one of the two social workers could tell that Misha, she's having a breakdown. This is the worst day of her life, very likely. And so one of the two women actually offered to Misha to come home with her and stay at her house instead of the safe house. And Misha agreed. And so that social worker and Misha, they would leave together, they would get into that woman's car, and they would drive to her house. And then the social worker told Misha that unfortunately now it was just a waiting game. They needed to wait for the police to get back in touch with them with more information. That night, as Misha lay in this woman's guest bedroom, looking up at the ceiling, wondering how the heck this had become her life, she began to think about the photo that her and Cassidy had took that had kind of started this whole horrible thing. And so Misha began to think about the day they took this picture, and all she remembered was that she and Cassidy were just kind of goofing around and smiling and making funny faces and just taking photos as they went. She certainly didn't think that one of those pictures they took would totally change her life. The following morning, when Misha woke up, the social worker brought her to their office, the social worker's office, and there they met with the other woman who had first met Misha in the principal's office, and the three of them just sat in the office, not talking much, eating chicken wings and other snacks, just literally waiting for police to call them. And finally, they would call. And when they did, one of the social workers answered the phone, and as she listened to what she was being told, she began to frown, and by the time she hung up, she was crying. The news from the police was the news Misha had been afraid of ever since sitting in the principal's office the day before and hearing this whole crazy story about her and Cassidy and this photo. The special pit stop that Misha and the social workers made at the medical clinic the day before on the way to the safe house was so that Misha could get a DNA test. And now the police were calling back with the results of the test. And what the results showed was Misha Solomon was not actually Misha Solomon. Her real name was Zephany Nurse. 17 years earlier, Zephany Nurse had been stolen out of her crib at the hospital in Cape Town, and despite a massive manhunt for her, she was never found. And so this was a huge, famous case in Cape Town, and most people assumed it would never be solved. But Misha's DNA had done just that. It proved that Misha's parents, who had loved her and raised her since she was a baby, were not actually her parents. Her mother, Lavana, was actually her kidnapper, and now she was under arrest. But even though this revelation was incredibly shocking and upsetting for Misha, it was not nearly as shocking as learning the identity of her real biological parents. The social workers took Misha from their office to the police station, where they told Misha her real biological parents were waiting to meet her. And so once they went inside the police station, Misha gripped onto the social worker's arm tightly. She was incredibly nervous, and she was led down a hallway to a door that was shut. And then finally, when Misha was ready, she pushed the door open, and her real parents, who were sitting right in front of her, they stood up and they ran towards her crying. But Misha just stood there, stunned and silent, staring at them. Because these people, they were not strangers to her. She knew them extremely well. They were the parents of her best friend in the world, Cassidy Nurse. Which meant Misha, aka Zephany Nurse, was Cassidy's sister. Months earlier, when Misha and Cassidy first met each other, the reason they hit it off so quickly and the reason they had similar senses of humor and liked the same things and looked so dramatically similar is because they were literally sisters. They just didn't know it. And then one day they took a series of selfie photos of themselves, and Cassidy, she would go home and show one of those photos to her parents and say, hey, look, my best friend, Misha Solomon, look how similar we look. And when Cassidy's parents looked at Misha Solomon, they instinctively knew that is our daughter. That is Zephany Nurse. And so they would bring this photo to the police, and the police would begin to investigate. And during this investigation, they began trailing Misha. So when Misha's aunt told Misha that she thought a white car was following her, she wasn't just being paranoid. Those were investigators following Misha around, trying to get a feel for her schedule, because they needed to approach her when she was alone in order to get a DNA sample. They were worried if they contacted Misha and tipped off what they were doing, she would tell her parents, who were actually her kidnappers, and then potentially they might take Misha and run away. So they couldn't risk that. They had to basically follow her around and wait for an opening to get this DNA test done. And so this was also the reason why Cassidy was acting so strangely towards Misha in the few days before the truth was revealed. It's because Cassidy knew about this investigation, and the police told her, you can't tip Misha off. She will tell her parents, her kidnappers, and they might abscond with her. And so Cassidy basically felt awkward and kind of just hid from Misha for a couple of days. The woman that Misha had grown up with and called her mom for her whole life, Lavana Solomon, was ultimately convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 10 years in prison. There has never been any evidence to suggest that Levana's husband, so Misha's dad for her whole life, actually knew that the baby had been kidnapped because 17 years earlier, Levana had been pregnant with their child. But it's believed she miscarried, and Levana did not share that with her husband. Instead, she told her husband that she had gone into labor while he was at work and delivered their child, and so that's how they had this baby, Zephany, when in reality, after Levana had miscarried, she had at some point dressed up like a nurse, gone into the hospital, and stolen Zephany. For her part, Zephany, aka Misha, stayed in touch with both sets of parents, the fake ones and her biological ones. And she would say that, she still loves the parents who kidnapped her because they raised her and they treated her well. And in fact, Zephany would actually wear that beautiful flowing red dress that Levana had stitched for her to her high school dance well after the news came out about who Levana was. Misha also decided that she would just keep the name Misha because that was what she was used to, instead of going back to her baby name, Zephany. On a cold and snowy day in January of 1994, a land surveyor for the North Carolina Department of Transportation parked his car at the edge of Highway 421 in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. After walking just a few yards away from the side of the road, he was already swallowed up in the deep woods that stretched for miles into Watauga County. Given the cold air and snow underfoot, the surveyor was paying close attention to where he was walking. That was, until the man glanced ahead at the fallen tree ahead of him, and before he saw something he just couldn't make sense of peeking out of the snow in the shadow of the upended roots. A moment later, he dropped the hard plastic case that contained his surveying equipment and nearly fell backward as he scrambled to get away from the mound of snow in front of him. Then, looking desperately through the thick trees for the other members of the survey team, the calm around him was shattered as he started yelling for help. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's stories, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyway. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and replace all of their family photos of pictures of you wearing their clothes in the same poses. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 6:30 p.m. on May 14, 1955, a 24-year-old man named Donald Giroux stood next to his friend, 28-year-old Murray Anderson, on the shore of a natural spring in the state of Georgia. The spring was called Radium Springs because literally there was radium in the water. Radium is a naturally occurring, highly radioactive metallic element, but there were such low levels of it in the water that it wasn't really a hazard. However, the radium did have an effect on the water. It made it practically neon blue, and so it was totally mesmerizing. I mean, you look at this thing and you know there's something different about this spring. Also, this spring was incredibly deep. So Donald and Murray were both members of the US Navy, and so naturally they spent a lot of time, in and around water, because that's what the Navy does. They work in and around water. But ironically, it was actually when Donald and Murray were not working that they spent the most amount of time in the water, because in their off time, they were recreational scuba divers. Except back in 1955, recreational scuba diving was totally not safe. And that was because, underwater diving certainly existed at the time. I mean, institutions like the Navy, they were prolific divers. But civilians did not really dive on their own. And so as a result, if you wanted to recreationally scuba dive, well, you didn't really have access to good equipment or even proper equipment. I mean, there just wasn't anything available to you.
And so for people like Donald and Murray, who did want to go explore the underwater abyss on their own, they had to literally make their own diving equipment, like their own oxygen tanks and their own flashlights and goggles. I mean, all of it. I mean, it was amateur. It was homemade equipment. And so that's what made it really dangerous. On top of, when you're underwater diving, as I've done myself, a lot of things can go wrong. And so that's also dangerous. And so the whole thing, it's asking for problems. But for Donald and Murray, it was actually the danger associated with recreational diving that made it so appealing. They liked the idea that other people were scared to go underwater, with their DIY equipment. For Donald and Murray, they loved it. They got a thrill out of it. And on top of that, they kind of felt like explorers. They got to go to places underwater where literally nobody else had gone before. In fact, they had already gone to other locations and mapped out, tunnels and underwater cave systems and all these different things that literally nobody else had done before. And they loved it. And today was going to be no different, because there were sections in Radium Springs that nobody had mapped, and they were going to go down there and see it for themselves. So after the two men looked at each other and nodded and just kind of gave the signal it was time to begin the dive, they donned their amateur equipment, their oxygen tanks and their goggles and their flippers, and then they walked into the neon blue water and submerged. A few minutes later, Donald and Murray had traveled about 70 feet straight down the water column. And at this point, the light is really fading. They can't really see too well. They did have flashlights that they had rigged up that they had waterproofed. But at this point, down 70 feet, it's getting pretty dark. But right in front of them, off to the side, was this huge entrance, this underwater tunnel entrance. And this was actually a well-known cavern. Like, this is actually where other recreational divers would go to if they went to Radium Springs. It was this cavern. But while the entrance to the cavern had been sort of mapped out and searched, there were all these little spidery offshoots once you got into this cavern that had not been explored. And so what Donald and Murray were going to do is go into the cavern and then basically start, splintering off and seeing what else was in there and mapping it out. Now, as much as Donald and Murray did like the sort of risks associated with this activity, they weren't completely reckless. They had attached a dive line when they had gone into the spring that they attached to the surface and they fed down with them. It's a 200-foot line, and they carried it with them. The lead diver would basically unspool as they went. The two divers would be right next to each other, and they'd be holding on to this line. And so when they would go into this cavern, if for some reason they got turned around or, if they got, totally confused, whatever it was, they could always just follow their line back out of the cavern, back up to the surface. This was not like rocket science. This is something that divers today still do. So using a dive line, very common practice, and Donald and Murray were doing just that. And so they went into this cavern, they got their dive line spooling out, and everything is totally fine. But once they were inside of this cavern, all the light completely went away. I mean, the cavern was relatively spacious, but, the light is coming straight down, and this tunnel entrance is basically, horizontal. And so once they're inside of this cavern, it's utterly pitch black. But Donald and Murray have dove other underwater cave systems. They knew going in how dark this cave system was going to be. They had their flashlights, that they had jerry-rigged to be waterproof, and they're holding on to their line, and they're going into this cavern looking for their first offshoot. But as they're going into this cavern, there's all this silt, all this mud that's kind of caked to the walls and the floor that began getting kicked up from their flippers and bumping into it. And before long, because of the silt and the lack of light, they could basically only see maybe 6 inches in front of them. Like, even shining their light, all they'd see is all the silt. And so very quickly, the visibility basically fell to 0. But, again, they're going in knowing this is the environment they're going into. They're confident, they're cool, they're moving along. But as the two divers were continuing through the cavern, getting deeper and deeper, and it's starting to get more and more restrictive, the deeper they go, they were about to go into this offshoot when Donald suddenly started seeing all these air bubbles coming up against him. And now he can't quite see where they're coming from, but there's only one place that an air bubble could be emerging from, and that's from his oxygen tank. And so clearly there's some sort of issue. He can't see because it's so dark. He also has homemade equipment, and so the risk of catastrophic failure is pretty high with his equipment. And so he begins trying to figure out where this leak is coming from, checking his equipment, trying to make it stop, but he can't. He can't really communicate to Walter, who's got the spool of dive line, who's continuing straight forward into this offshoot. He can't quite tell him what's going on. They can't actually speak to each other. Again, it's pitch black, there's silt, it's sort of, claustrophobic and stressful. And so ultimately, Donald grabs Murray and just tries to shake him and sort of signal, hey, I got an issue here, but he had no way of knowing if Murray actually understood. But Donald, he knew he just had to get out of there. He had to go back to the surface and fix his issue before it got way worse. And so, even though he knew he was kind of leaving his buddy here, he's thinking, okay, Murray's got the dive line, he's experienced, I just grabbed him, everything's gonna be okay. And Donald turned around, kicked up more silt, and held onto that dive line, but now followed it back out of the cavern and back up to the surface. And when he got to the surface, he took a big breath. He was saved, he checked his equipment and realized, wherever the issue was, and he was actually able to fix the issue. And so before long, after only being on the surface for a couple of minutes, he had put his equipment back on, he was back in the water and following the dive line back down towards the cavern. As Donald began his descent down towards that cavern, 70 feet down, the whole time he's holding onto the dive line, making sure he doesn't lose that. But really what he's focused on is checking his equipment, because as he's going down, he's got basic visibility here. It's not gonna be like in the cavern where you can't see anything. And so as he's going down, he's checking his equipment and just making sure that there isn't a leak. And by the time he got all the way down 70 feet and the dive line turned and went into that cavern, Donald was feeling pretty good that his equipment was good, it was not malfunctioning, and it was safe to go back into the cavern with Murray. And so that's what he does. He's got his flashlight in one hand, he's got the dive line in the other, and he's now looking straight into this dark opening of this cavern, and in Donald goes, the whole time holding onto that dive line. And pretty much immediately, once inside the cavern, the flashlight became useless because again, the silt's still kicked up, there's no current running through this cavern, so the silt is not going anywhere. But either way, Donald knew what he was doing. He was going straight in there to connect with Murray and continue this dive and see what else is in here and, map it out for other divers. And so into the cavern he goes, he's holding the dive line in one hand, he's got his flashlight and he's going deeper and deeper into this cavern. And the whole time he's expecting at any moment, he's just gonna bump into Murray. But he just keeps going and going deeper and deeper into the system. The walls are getting tighter and tighter around him. And eventually he reaches the very end of the dive line, 200 feet at this point, deep into this cavern. And there's no Murray. Murray's gone. Now Donald, he's looking around. Remember, it's total darkness. All he's got is this flashlight, which basically just illuminates the silt that's been kicked up all around him. But where he is at this exact moment, the silt wasn't too bad. It was just like this abyss all around him. It's totally black. There's nothing around him. And in a sudden panic, Donald thinks, oh my goodness, I'm so far into this cavern, I haven't found Murray, like something's happened to him. He's run out of air or he's gotten lost. Like, how could he have let go of the dive line? What's going on here? And so Donald immediately just starts going down to the bottom of the cave and searching the ground, thinking that, maybe Murray got to this point and passed out and sunk to the bottom, but he gets to the bottom of the cave, there's nothing there, he starts feeling the tunnels, there's nothing, and at this point he's kicked up even more silt, and so, he really can't see anything. And he's thinking, it took me a while to get in here, and I'm running low on oxygen right now. I need to get help immediately, because Murray, he's gonna run out of time really quickly here. And so Donald, he turns around and holding onto this dive line, he pulls himself out of the cavern. He goes back to the surface. Some part of him was hoping that when he got up there that he would just magically see Murray waiting for him, but nope, he's all alone. There's nobody here. And at that point, Donald took off his gear and he contacted authorities. Not long after that, 2 commercial divers, along with an entire US Navy dive team, arrived at Radium Springs and began looking for Murray. And they searched and they searched and they couldn't find him until 8 a.m. the next morning, 12 hours after Donald had surfaced. It would turn out when Donald had that malfunction that caused him to leave the cavern and leave Murray behind and go to the surface and fix himself and then go back down again. Well, in that space of time that he was away from Murray, Murray continued to spool out the dive line, maybe not necessarily knowing that Donald had left him at this point, and Murray got all the way to the end of the dive line, 200 feet, and at that point, in this uncharted tunnel he was in, Somehow or another, Murray became disconnected from the dive line. Maybe he let go of it, maybe he bumped into something, we don't know. But either way, he let go of the dive line, basically right at the end of the dive line. And when Donald came back down and got to the end of that dive line and discovered Murray wasn't there, well, what he didn't know is that Murray actually was just a couple of feet away. He was basically right above him, because that's where Murray was ultimately found. He had drowned literally feet away from the dive line, but Donald, he couldn't see him, and in a total panic state, in an effort to find Murray, Donald began fumbling around, going down and rubbing up against the bottom and the walls, kicking up all this silt. And you gotta figure at this exact moment, Murray, who's very much alive at this point, almost certainly, is right above him, and now his visibility, which was already terrible, he's probably scared to death because he's looking for this dive line, and now the silt is just getting kicked up all around him. He probably knows Donald's nearby. He's swimming around looking for Donald. Donald's looking for Murray. They swim right past each other. It's absolute madness. But then eventually Donald just vanishes because he's going to find help. And Murray is left all by himself in total darkness, disoriented, terrified, has no idea where the dive line is. Silt is making it impossible to know what direction he's even going. And so in Murray's final moments, he just scrambled around trying to find his way out again until he eventually drowned, again, just feet away from his dive line, the very thing that would have brought him to safety. Hey guys, did you know you can get your strange, dark, and mysterious fix anytime, anywhere with the MrBallen podcast on Amazon Music? Well, you can. There are tons of stories waiting to be binged right now, plus there are exclusive stories on there that have never been shared on this YouTube channel. Amazon Music listeners get to listen to new episodes an entire month before everybody else. You can also listen to my other show, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, 2 weeks early and totally ad-free on Amazon Music. If you're already a Prime member, well, you already have access to those 2 shows, plus hundreds of other top podcasts ad-free, all at no extra cost. That's right, your Prime membership includes Amazon Music absolutely free. So if you're ready to dive deeper into strange, dark, and mysterious stories, well, go download the Amazon Music app today and listen to the MrBallen podcast and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Now, back to today's stories. On May 28, 2022, a photographer named April Vertucci, along with 2 of her friends, snuck towards this abandoned funeral home in Flint, Michigan. The funeral home was a big brick building right off a main road in the center of the city, and April and her 2 friends knew there were lots of people that were kind of looking in this direction, and it was illegal to go into this property, and so very carefully they snuck their way towards the back door of the building. And they saw the door was, completely attached to its hinges. It was in good shape, appeared to be locked, but they thought, what the heck? They walked up to the door, took a look around. April reached down, tried the handle, and it pulled right open. And as soon as this happened, April was psyched, because not only was she a photographer, but she was also an urban explorer, which meant she would sneak into places like this, abandoned buildings and other man-made sites, just to have a look around. One, because it was fun and exciting, but also because she got to use her photography, taking cool pictures of places like this funeral home. And so April's friends were also into urban exploring, and as soon as this door came open, it was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe we're gonna get to explore this legendary site. So this funeral home had been shut down about 5 years earlier because of reports of unsanitary conditions inside. Anonymous reporters had gone in and discovered that there were literally like human remains out. There were up to 40 bodies being stored in one room with no air conditioning, so they're just rotting. There's maggots all over the place. There's embalming liquids on the ground. There's blood everywhere. I mean, basically, this place was like the site of a horror movie. And so the state comes in, they shut this place down, and the owner, after being shut down, just abandons the building, just leaves it exactly the way they had left it. I mean, the bodies were removed by the state, but all the equipment for the funeral home was just left behind. Everything was sealed up, and that was that. And the place was deemed off limits. But naturally, urban explorers found out about this and began going in to see this horror show for themselves. And so April and her friends, they had heard about this place and immediately were like, we gotta go in there. We gotta see it for ourselves. And so they hopped in a car and they drove over 3 hours from Ohio to Michigan just to check this place out. And now here they were, door open, and in they go. Once the door shut behind them, April and her two friends were looking down this long, dark hallway. It's totally silent inside. The walls were made out of cinder block that had been painted white, but the paint was all chipping off and they had their flashlights out and it's dark and creepy and they're looking down the hallway. And just for a second, they just stop and listen to see if anybody else is inside of here moving around. Maybe other urban explorers or even other animals or anything, squatters, they don't know. But they're sitting there for a second just listening and they don't hear anything. And so with April in front, they begin walking down this hallway. And as they're walking, there's all this trash on the ground. It's totally eerie as they're walking. Every little sound is sort of startling them. They're kind of laughing as they're going. And eventually, April stops in front of this first door that she sees, the first door off the hallway, and it's closed. And right across the center of this door is this big caution sign saying, stay back. And then underneath the caution sign, it says formaldehyde. And so April and her friends knew that, okay, well, formaldehyde is a chemical used to embalm bodies, something funeral homes did. And so they know that behind this door very likely was the embalming room, where funeral homes would literally pump dead bodies full of formaldehyde and prep the bodies, to be presented at the wake, before they're actually laid to rest. It's like this is where actual dead bodies are manipulated. And so April and her friends are pretty excited. And so April's, she opens up the door and they look inside of this room and it's very eerie. It's pretty much vacant. But in the center of this room, it's all dark. They have their flashlights, right? In the center of the room is this metal table, this standalone metal table. It's like a gurney. And it's where the dead body would be placed as they're being embalmed. And then on the walls all around are all these shelves with various tools and, vials of various milky liquids. There's a saw, there's scissors, there's scalpels. On the ground, there's, fabric that appears to have some sort of bodily fluids on it. I mean, this really looks like the scene of a horror movie. But for April and her friends, it's like, this is a gold mine. I mean, this is what we came here for. And so April and her friends, for the next little bit, they just began walking all around the embalming room. April taking photos and her friends and April kind of moving things around, seeing what was in there. And then eventually, they left and they continued to search the building and they found a chapel where there were caskets laying around. They also went into a garage and they found there was an old hearse just left inside the garage. I mean, the place really was as creepy as everybody said it was. And so it was sometime around discovering the garage that the girls had gone back to the main hallway and they discovered this other door that they hadn't seen when they were searching over the first 30 minutes they had been in there. And this door led to this ominous stairwell that went down into what appeared to be the basement. And so at this point, the girls felt like they had sort of searched the entire main floor and, the two friends, not April, they really wanted to go down these steps and explore the basement. They'd been here long enough that it seemed pretty clear that they were the only ones there. It had been totally quiet. And even though it was creepy, ultimately they sort of felt safe at this point. And April did too, but she also was having a great time still taking pictures on the first floor. And so at this point, the group decided to split up. The two friends would go down into the basement, and April, for a little bit longer, would stay up on the first floor and just continue taking photos, and then she would join them. And so, no big deal, they split up, the girls go down to the basement, April's taking her photos, doing her thing, and just a couple of minutes later, April hears her friends in the basement, through the floors, yelling out something to the effect of, "Oh my gosh, is that real?" And then the other friend is like, "Yes, that is real, oh my gosh." And so April, she runs to that doorway, she goes down the stairs, and she finds her friends at the foot of the stairs. And they're looking out into the main space of the basement that April can't quite see yet. And so she goes right down to her friends, she's looking at them, they look horrified, they're looking out at something obviously terrible in the basement. And April turns from her friends to the basement, and what she sees makes no sense. There's just like this empty basement, with some stuff pushed up against the walls, but in the middle of the basement is what appears to be like this standalone metal jail cell. Like imagine metal rungs that you would imagine in a jail, but all the way around. It's about 8 feet tall, 10 feet wide, 4 feet deep. It's just this inexplicable standalone jail cell. At least that's the way April interpreted it, and so did her friends. And as she's looking at it, April, she sees that in the middle of the jail cell, if you will, is like this big metal box that's just sitting on the floor in the center of the cell, and then right above it in the ceiling is this pretty big cutout, like a hole in the ceiling. And so April sees this and takes in what she's seeing, and she can't really process it. She doesn't really understand what this is. And she's looking at her friends, and they're so horrified. They've been yelling out about something being real, like, what is that? Oh my gosh. And she's kind of looking back and forth, and then she sees it. She sees there's something else inside of this jail cell. And when she sees it, she recoils in horror. She grabs her friends. They sprint out of the funeral home, and they call the authorities. When authorities arrived, they went right down into the basement and they looked inside of that jail cell, and quickly they determined that April and her friends had not been alone inside of this building like they had thought. It would turn out 6 days earlier, a local man who had nothing to do with April and her friends, totally separate, had gone to this funeral home to have a look around. Except he wasn't an urban explorer. He was not going in here to have a good time or take photos. He was going inside to steal scrap metal and try to sell it for a profit. And so he made his way inside the funeral home. He looked around, he didn't really find much, but eventually went down into the basement. And when he got down there, he turned, he looked out at that space down there, and he saw this jail cell, this metal jail cell that just kind of sat in the middle of the basement. Except what he would have seen is just the bars that sort of surrounded the outside of the cell, the actual cell itself. The metal box in the middle that was on the floor that April saw and her friend saw, that was not there. And the hole in the ceiling would not have been there. He would have just seen basically a lot of metal in the middle of the basement. So he's thinking, I've hit the jackpot. This is exactly what I've come here for, to take this metal and go sell it. And so this man, he goes into the jail cell, into this cage, and he quickly realizes the actual metal struts that made up the cage, even if they were super valuable, they were thick and difficult to cut through, and so realistically, they were going to be really hard to extricate and get out of this place. But when the man is actually inside of this jail cell, this cage, he sees there's actually some other metal that he hadn't seen when he first came down that might be far easier to extract. Basically, right in the middle of this cell were additional metal rods that were running from the ceiling down to the ground. They were far thinner and easier to move around. And he's thinking, I could actually cut these and get these out of here and turn a profit on them, and then come back at a later date with, more people or more powerful tools to cut the metal that sort of was the cage, the stuff that he had originally seen. And so, feeling pretty optimistic, the guy put his stuff down, his phone, his wallet, his other things off to the side, in the cage. And then he got out his bolt cutters and he cut the very first one of these thinner cables right in the middle of the cell. And as soon as he cut one of them, there was this loud rumbling sound he would have heard right above him. And then this big metal box came crashing down and pinned him to the ground. It would turn out what this man had walked inside of was not a jail cell in the basement of the funeral home. It was actually the inner workings of something known as a casket lift. Basically, the funeral home has to raise caskets from the basement where potentially they're stored up to the main floor to be used. And, they're pretty cumbersome, big things that need to get moved around. And so effectively, they have an elevator that brings them up. And so that big metal box that came crashing down on this guy was the actual lift itself that actually carried up the caskets. And the cord that he cut were actually the cords that supported that lift. And so as soon as he cut one of them, he was cutting the support to effectively the elevator car that was right above him that then fell and crushed him. However, he didn't die from getting crushed. He just got trapped. And as soon as he realized he was trapped and being kind of crushed to death here, he reached for his phone, but he realized his phone was just barely outside of his reach. He couldn't get to his phone. And nobody knew he was here. This was an illegal activity. He didn't broadcast where he was going. And so he's stuck. He can't call anyone, and no one knows he's here. And so for 6 days, that lift gradually crushed this man to death. And then finally, when April and her friends showed up and they went down in the basement, they didn't just see, this destroyed casket lift. They saw this dead man's body, and he was literally outstretched, still reaching for his phone. On the morning of September 10th, 1987, police constable Dick Ellis walked into an interview room in a police station in South Yorkshire, England. Inside of this room was a table, and sitting on the other side of this table were these two security guards. One was named Stephen Brooks, and the other was named David Goldthorpe. And from PC Ellis's perspective, his first impression of these two guys is they were like big, burly, tough-looking men. He could tell they were both visibly shaken, like something had really rattled both of these guys. However, before Ellis could even sit down and begin asking basic questions about what was going on here, these two security guards just launched into this totally crazy-sounding story. The men told Ellis that the night before, they had been patrolling this construction site, where workers were building a 6-mile stretch of highway and bridge that were called the Stocks Bridge Bypass. Now, at this time of night, there was nobody at the site, no workers, nothing like that. And so really, it was the security guard's job to make sure nobody entered the site and either tampered with equipment or tried to steal anything. Now, the night had been very routine and quiet until around midnight. It was at that point that David and Stephen, these two security guards, had reached the bridge, the half-constructed bridge portion of this bypass. And as they're walking along the highway and they see the bridge out in front of them, they stopped because they saw clearly there was a figure standing on this bridge. It almost looked like a man who was wearing a long jacket, like a cloak or something, and he appeared to be staring down below the bridge, down towards the valley underneath what the bridge was actually going over. Like this man clearly had not spotted the security guards. And so naturally, they began calling out to this guy, asking him like, hey, what are you doing here? What's going on? This is a private construction site, like you need to go. But the guy on the bridge didn't react. He just kept staring down to the valley below. And so at that point, as the two security guards are now walking in the direction of this guy, one of them lifts up his flashlight and shines it at this man. And when he does, the beam of light appears to just go through this man's body, like his body isn't solid, and the light just passed right through. And as soon as they did that, both Stephen and David just stopped, shocked at what they're seeing, aiming this light at the sky. And as they're doing this, the figure appeared to kind of turn and look at David and Stephen. And they were so unsettled and terrified by it that instead of protecting the construction site, they just turned and ran. And they went to the police. Now, after PC Ellis had been told this story, he did not believe in any way that what they had experienced was supernatural. He's thinking, okay, clearly, you saw some guy and, maybe he shouldn't have been there and maybe it was a trick of the light or something, or maybe that wasn't a person at all and you just thought it was. Like, who knows? But there has to be a logical, rational explanation here. And so feeling kind of annoyed that he was called in to deal with this, Ellis looks at these two guys and he's like, look, this is not a police matter. Why don't you guys, if you're so shaken up by this, go talk to the church or something. Like, this is not something we can help you with. And at that, the two security guards just said, okay, and they got up and they left. And Ellis, truthfully, didn't think about this at all. It was like, okay, great, that's done. I don't got to deal with that. And he went on with his day. But later that day, Ellis got a call from his boss being like, hey, did you tell two security guards who came in here to go talk to the church about some ghosts they saw at a construction site or something? And at this, Ellis had to kind of explain what had happened and how he had sort of flippantly told them to, go see the church if they really thought they saw a ghost. But his boss was like, well, they took you literally, and they are currently at the local church, those two security guards right now, and they are refusing to leave unless the church helps them with this ghost situation. And so Ellis's boss told him that you just need to go to the church, get these two guys to calm down, and leave. Go do that right now. And so Ellis is like, I can't believe they took that seriously. Okay, fine. So he hops in his cruiser, he goes to the church, he finds these two guys who are still totally shaken up and they're pleading with people to take them seriously. Somebody needs to go out there and see what's on the bridge, see what this could have been. And Ellis is like, guys, I will tonight go to the bridge, I will check it out, I'll see what's going on there if you leave the church and you don't come back. Like, leave these people alone. And at this, David and Stephen, they're totally relieved. They're like, oh, you will? Oh my gosh, great. We'll leave, thank you, let us know what you find. And they left the church. And so they left, and PC Ellis is like, okay, great, I guess tonight I'm gonna go looking for ghosts. And so that night, around midnight, PC Ellis and his partner drove over to the construction site. Specifically, they went to the bridge. They got on the road that actually went underneath this unfinished bridge, and they camped out on this lower road. Looking straight up in front of them was this bridge. They're basically just going to monitor this bridge because that's where the security guards claim to have seen this figure, this ghost. They're going to stake out this bridge, see what happens, call it good. Now, at first, nothing happened on this bridge. Ellis and his partner just sat there, staring, bored up at this bridge, waiting for, the time to pass by so they could leave. But at some point, Ellis noticed movement up on the bridge, and so did his partner. Now, they couldn't quite tell what it was, and they couldn't even see if it was still moving around anymore, but clearly something had moved on the bridge. And so for a couple of seconds, Ellis and his partner are just staring really intently up at the bridge, waiting to see something else happen, but, nothing else did. And so Ellis is like, well, I gotta go up there and check because, maybe there is some guy who's trespassing on the construction site, and that's what the security guard saw. Like, I gotta go up there and see, because from down here, we really can't see too well. And so Ellis told his partner to just stay put in the car, that he, Ellis, would go up on the bridge and have a look around. And so Ellis, he got out of the car, all he had was a flashlight, and he began walking over to the bottom of this bridge. And there was actually a ladder he would have to climb up to the actual bridge, because remember, they're on the road below this bridge. And so Ellis, he gets to the ladder, he begins climbing up the ladder, and as he's going up, he's kind of staring up, almost expecting somebody to poke their head over, but, it's quiet, no one's looking over the edge. And eventually, Ellis gets to the top, and he climbs onto the bridge, and again, it's this unfinished bridge, there's no traffic up here, and he looks roughly in the direction of where he thought he saw movement when he was down in the car looking up here, which also happened to be roughly the area where the two security guards had described seeing the figure that their light had shone through. And sure enough, Ellis looks and he sees there's this cloaked figure standing a little ways off of the side of the bridge, apparently just looking down towards his police car. And Ellis, at first, he's kind of shocked. He can't believe that, there's some legitimacy to the story these guys had told, and he couldn't help but be kind of frightened for a second. But then Ellis raised his flashlight and shined it at this figure, and as soon as he did, he just laughed. Because all it was a plastic tarp wrapped around some construction equipment. That's what the security guards clearly had seen. And, when they shine their light, it's a clear plastic tarp here. The light could theoretically go through it. You can kind of see how they would think, oh my gosh, it's a ghost. And so Ellis is like, this is all this was. This was nothing. I knew it was nothing, and now I know it's nothing. And so after doing a cursory walk around the bridge to, make sure nobody was up there, and, he looked around, there wasn't anybody there, Ellis went back to the ladder, climbed back down, got in the car with his partner, and explained to him that this whole thing was a joke. And of course, there's no ghost, there's no criminals, there's nothing. This is no big deal. Now, Ellis and his partner could have, at this point, just left and gone home, but they had told their boss they'd come out here for at least an hour, and they'd only been here for maybe 30 minutes at this point. And so the two of them decided, you know what, just because we said we would, let's just stay here a little bit longer and make sure nobody goes on this bridge. We'll give it another, 30 minutes or so. And so Ellis and his partner just kind of sit back in their seats and settle in for this last little stretch of their shift. However, about 20 minutes into this final 30 minutes, Ellis is still just sitting there, his window's open, and he's just kind of doing nothing, waiting around, when suddenly he's hit with this unbelievably cold gust of air that comes into the car through his window. And it's kind of sudden, he's being hit with this gust of cold air. And then at the same time, Ellis began feeling this incredible pressure on his chest. It was so intense, he thought he was having a heart attack, and he wanted to say something to his partner, but it was he couldn't even move. He's frozen, he's getting scared, he doesn't know what's happening. And as much as he wanted to yell out and get his partner's attention to help him, he suddenly had this overwhelming feeling that there was someone off to the side staring at him, someone right outside the car. And even though he didn't want to look, he found himself slowly turning and looking out his open window. And right there, immediately outside the door, is this man standing practically pressed up against the window. His torso is inches away from Ellis's face, just standing there inexplicably. This guy snuck up on them. They didn't even hear him. And so Ellis, at this point, he breaks out of his sort of trance. He screams and gets his partner's attention, and then he pushes open his door, and he jumps out to confront this person who snuck up on them. But there's no one outside the car. And so Ellis, he turns to his partner and he's like, hey, did you just see what I just saw? Did you see that guy? And Ellis's partner, who's totally ashen-faced, just looks at Ellis and he's like, yeah, I did see him. And so after looking around for a couple more seconds, Ellis climbed back into the car, and then he and his partner debriefed what had just happened. And Ellis's partner would tell Ellis that from his seat, he actually had a better vantage point than Ellis did to seeing this guy. I mean, Ellis was basically right on top of this guy, but his partner was a little bit farther back and had a better angle. And he would tell Ellis that at some point he had turned and seen the guy standing there. And the guy, he was wearing this old coat, this long coat that sort of looked like it belonged in the 1800s or something. And the partner would say, like, he didn't hear this guy approach. He didn't know how he got there. But at some point, he said the guy in the coat, the guy outside, crouched down just enough that he was looking in the car in the direction of Ellis's partner. And Ellis's partner said he was staring right at the guy, but the guy, he had no face. Ultimately, Ellis and his partner would return to the station that night, and they would file a report about what happened to them. But they would simply describe it as inexplicable phenomenon, and after filing it, they basically hoped they would never have to talk about it again. Except that wouldn't be possible, because shortly after filing that report, the construction was finished, and so the highway and the bridge were open to the public. And pretty much right away, people started dying on that bridge. Like a crazy high number of people just inexplicably would get in these fatal accidents on the bridge. And this bridge was not like especially hazardous. It was a beautiful, brand new bridge. I mean, there really should not have been this many accidents. But it was not just that so many people were dying on this bridge inexplicably. No, also in tandem with all the fatal accidents were all the independently reported sightings of this dark figure standing on the bridge that had no face. So the leading theory amongst people who believe what's happening at this bridge is basically paranormal is that the construction of this bridge and the highway disturbed a gravesite, and that has led to all the tragedy and death that has followed. But they've never actually been able to prove if there really was a gravesite where this bridge or the highway was built. The two security guards, Stephen Brooks and David Goldthorpe, both quit their jobs. As for Ellis and his partner, they've never changed their stories, and they also have never found a reasonable explanation for what they saw. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.